Chapter 1093. Huh? What's wrong? As if sensing Huaishi's sluggishness, Fu Yi blinked slightly and said reasonably, "If you don't know how to draw, you can change it to something else." "No need." After a slight pause, Huaishi's movements returned to normal. "I'm just hesitating where to draw." As if he was carefully considering the angle and position, he reached out and lifted Fu Yi's chin. The slightly trembling marker finally fell on her face. Fu Yi was slightly stunned, but she still closed her eyes and let him do what he wanted. She felt the cold tip of the pen fall on her forehead and wander, steady and calm, without any hesitation. Just like that, 1 stroke, 2 strokes, then 3 strokes, 4 strokes, 5 strokes, 6 strokes. She opened her eyes in confusion. She saw Huaishi's solemn expression and extremely serious appearance. His strokes were as smooth as if they were divine. But the question was, why did he draw so many strokes when he was just drawing a heart? "You're not done yet?" She widened her eyes in confusion. "Wait a moment, I'm drawing." Huaishi's movements did not stop. He was careful and serious. "I just finished drawing the right atrium, and I'm already drawing the pulmonary valve." It was visible to the naked eye that Fu Yi's eyes twitched. But soon, she couldn't help but burst out laughing. She didn't say anything else. The last stroke was done. "It's not bad." She returned to her seat, took out her phone, and looked at the lifelike anatomical heart on her forehead and side face. She raised her hand and took a selfie. She seemed to be quite satisfied with Huaishi's work. "It's fine," she said. "This is fine too." Next to her, Lily looked at it enviously and raised her hand to ask, "I want one too. It's so repetitive to always draw the heart." "You can ask him to draw the head for you," Fu Yi faithfully suggested. "The heart, liver, spleen, and lungs can also be divided into a few portions. There are also arms and legs, right?" In his chair, Huaishi, who was almost exhausted, twitched his face. He didn't know if he should thank his good brother for leaving the large intestine for him. At least he could make a sashimi, right? Soon, the brief interlude was over. The game continued. The torture of Huaishi continued. With Fu Yi taking the lead, everyone's subsequent requests began to get stranger and stranger. This included, but was not limited to, a dog's head, a nautilus, a world-wide world card face, a cello, a game console. By the time dawn finally arrived, Huaishi was already physically and mentally exhausted. "I feel like I've drawn almost everything that I can and know how to draw. I hate the fact that I'm not a Doomsday artist, nor have I done any research. Otherwise, wouldn't I be able to draw a live 2D? But no matter what, the long night was finally over. He felt like he was going to get PTSD whenever he saw cards. Compared to this deadly Uno, he would rather go to hell and find a few crowns to fight. At least that would be easier. He didn't have time to catch up on his sleep. After breakfast, he headed to the Foundry Center and started his work. In the past, he would complain that there were too many things to do and that he couldn't finish them no matter how hard he tried. But now, he couldn't help but shed tears of joy when he started working. He was too happy at work. "No one can stop me from working." Unfortunately, work couldn't help him escape from reality for too long. Just before noon, he received a notice from Yuan. The practice at the Continuation Academy had ended. After collecting the changes and data of the local Silver Sea projection, the interns were ready to leave. For a moment, Huaishi froze in place. After a long time, Yuan looked at her teacher in a daze and coughed softly. After a long time, she saw Huaishi finally come back to his senses and whispered inexplicably, "You don't even eat lunch, teacher?" Yuan was puzzled. "No, nothing." Huaishi shook his head, closed the document in his hand and put down the pen. "I have something urgent to do. I'll be back in the afternoon. You can deal with these things first." After picking up the coat on the hanger, he hurried out. Yuan stared at his leaving figure in confusion. After a long time, she helplessly looked at the things on the table. "Sigh. Is the teacher skipping work again? Alright, let's go, Gemma. Stop giggling. In the lobby of Rongguan Hotel, Fu Yi helplessly tugged at her colleague. Can you at least wipe your mouth? You're almost drooling on the ground. Hee, I'm fine now. I'm too good. I'm too good. Gemma hugged the large stack of autographed photos and accessories that Fu Yi had brought back. She couldn't bear to let go of them. She touched one photo, then another. All of them were so cute and charming. Especially this bronze ornament with the disaster sword's personal signature. Ah, this enchanting fragrance, this seductive color, these exquisite details. Hey, can't you get in the car first? Fu Yi reached out and forcefully snatched those things over. She stuffed them into her bag and pushed her to the taxi outside the door. However, before she could sit down, she saw the figure standing in the corner across the road. He was waving at her. Fu Yi paused and slapped her head. Gemma, I left something behind. Go to the station first and remember to tell the tutor for me. With that, she patted the car door and motioned for the driver to leave first. Fortunately, her roommate was still immersed in her unspeakable worldly desires and didn't ask much. She was sent away with a silly smile like the golden retriever in the car. Fu Yi crossed the road and looked at Huaishur. You're so polite. You even came to send me off? I feel that your words don't sound quite right. Huaishur sighed, troubled. Did you leave so quickly? It's an internship anyway, Fu Yi said. We go to a place, eat something, finish our work, and then go to the next place. We were able to stay for 2 days because Principal Russell was willing to let us broaden our horizons. It's still a little rushed, Huaishur said dryly. We didn't have time to entertain you this time. Isn't that good? Fu Yi said with a smile. Everyone gathered for dinner, drank some wine, and played games. I also met new friends. Huaishur was silent for a long time, not knowing what to say. In the end, he could only sigh helplessly. I'm sorry. Did I say anything? Fu Yi seemed to be puzzled. With her hands behind her back, she tilted her head and looked at him. Besides, shouldn't I be the one apologizing? You're so embarrassed. You don't look like the majestic Sir Navigator at all. That kind of title is given by others casually. Huaishur shook his head indifferently. I don't care about that. You're still the same, Huaishur. Haven't you changed? Well, if you've changed, I might not care so much, right? Fu Yi looked at him and sighed with nostalgia. You're always like this, Huaishur. No matter how close you are, you're always unpredictable. You used to be like this. You lived your own life and struggled on your own. If others didn't take the initiative to reach out, you would never open your mouth. In fact, I've never understood. What are you thinking in your heart? Fu Yi paused for a moment and asked softly, Do you care about me? Huaishur opened his mouth and wanted to say something. However, to be honest, seeing you so flustered really makes me happy. Fu Yi smiled. She leaned closer, tiptoed, and looked into Huaishur's eyes. She looked at her reflection in the fog, so clear. Now I can finally see it. Huaishur was stunned for a moment. He felt a slight movement in front of his chest, and the teacher's brooch on his collar was taken off by Fu Yi. He was caught off guard. Let's take this as a farewell gift. She took a step back proudly and smiled as she shook the trophy in her hand. Also, thank you for your kindness. I will treasure this and this. You actually used a sneak attack? Huaishur asked helplessly. This is called outsmarting. Fu Yi blinked and smiled playfully. Because of someone, I didn't catch a taxi. Can I ask Mr. Navigator to send me to the station? Sure. Huaishur nodded. I just got my driver's license, and my skills are not very good. When did you get the car? Anyway, there's still time. You can drive slowly. Then let's go. Huaishur turned around and walked in front. After taking 2 steps, the girl behind him caught up with him. She smiled, her hands behind her back, holding her trophy. Her footsteps were light. She was like a proud cat. So free. After sending Fu Yi away, Huaishur was not able to wander outside for too long. He had to attend the press conference in the afternoon. The deep cooperation plan between the Ivory Tower and the Dark Net was represented by Navigator Huaishur, who signed an agreement with creator Hela. After days of preparation, the entire press conference was held and ended smoothly. Huaishur shook hands with the girl beside him and smiled at the reporter's camera, officially announcing that the two sides had entered a deeper level of cooperation. The integration of resources, the sharing of technology, and the development of new fields. All the content disclosed to the public meant that the territory of celestial genealogy had once again expanded. This would be the return of the three wise men system, and the remnants of the utopia were once again trying to reorganize. As for whether they could cooperate as closely as before and reunite as one again, it would depend on the next moves of both sides. In any case, everyone could feel that the behemoth that had been silent for many years had once again taken a crucial step forward. However, no matter how intimate the press conference was and how happy the time was, when the press conference ended and the interface and agreement between the two sides were confirmed, Lily still had to go back. There was still more work to be done. Compared to playing and taking a vacation, there were more important things waiting for her. No matter how much she wanted to stay here. Let's stop here, Mr. Huaishur. At the dock, Lily saw KP, who was waving at her from a ship not far away. She stopped and turned back to say goodbye to Huaishur, solemnly and seriously. Thank you for the past 2 days. Don't mention it. Huaishur said apologetically, I didn't treat you well. No, you didn't. Lily shook her head vigorously and smiled brightly. The tour was great, and so was the dinner party. Plus, everyone played cards together. It was all very good, even better than I thought. In just 2 short days, I saw all kinds of things and made so many new friends. It would be great if we could play together again in the future. Huaishur's eyes twitched and he was speechless. Of course, the most important thing was that I saw Mr. Huaishur at work. Not noticing the subtle change in his expression, Lily continued excitedly, Mr. Fong's hospitality was also very good. Mr. Beelzebub and Mr. Fishball were also very nice. No, forget about Beelzebub. That guy had been talking to people online at a high intensity recently. Once he opened his mouth, he couldn't stop talking. The more Huaishur listened, the more guilty he felt. There was a kind of speechless shame. Everyone is very mature, just like adults. Lily sighed. I always feel that Mr. Huaishur's friends, except for me, are all admirable and enviable. No, actually, there are many people who only know how to cause trouble, and some are bald. Huaishur comforted her. Lily, you're already very good. But I want to be like everyone else, like Mr. Huaishur and the others around me. Lily tugged at the corner of her clothes. If I can grow up a little more. If I can be more mature than now. Can I? The more she spoke, the lower her voice became. In the end, it was barely audible. Gradually, she lowered her head in depression. Huaishur took a step forward and reached out to rub her hair. But she suddenly raised her head, took a deep breath, and summoned the last of her courage. When that day comes, I have something to say to Mr. Huaishur. At that time, please listen to me. Her voice trembled. Like a frightened bird, she spread her wings and wanted to escape. But her eyes were still fixed on Huaishur. She waited for his reply. After a short silence, Huaishur didn't evade anymore. He told her seriously, Okay, at that time, no matter what Lily wants to say to me, I'll definitely listen carefully. We've made an appointment? Yes. Huaishur nodded firmly. We've made an appointment. Thus, the young girl smiled happily, as if she had obtained the entire world. In the end, she hugged Huaishur tightly, then took a few steps back and waved goodbye. Then goodbye, Mr. Huaishur. Okay, goodbye. Huaishur nodded and watched her figure disappear into the distance. Until the traces of the ship disappeared at the end of the ocean, he sighed in disappointment. She's gone far, Huaishur. Behind him, a gentle voice sounded. It's time to pay attention to the big sister behind me. Otherwise, I'll be very frustrated. Huaishe turned around in surprise and saw Luo Xian in the distance. She was sitting on a bench by the shore, her long hair fluttering in the sea breeze, and a heavy bag beside her. She smiled at Huaishe. Is this the legendary NTR scene? Chapter 1094. Is this the legendary NTR scene? Unexpectedly, while Huaishe wasn't paying attention, Luo Xian appeared beside him and asked curiously. Huaishe was stunned. For a moment, he didn't know if he should panic or panic, but at this moment, he didn't feel any uneasiness at all. When she looked at Huaishe, only a quiet and gentle glow filled her eyes. Huaishe felt ashamed. In the sea breeze, Huaishe couldn't help but rub his face and sighed helplessly. Senior, where did you learn these things? Isn't that what the books say? Luo Xian opened her backpack in confusion and took out a lot of treasures from the crows, including shiny glass beads, garlands, exaggerated wrestling posters, and even a lot of small books that had to be mosaicked. With just a glance, she saw a series of discordant words such as a woman is committing adultery. Soon, they were destroyed and erased in Huaishe's anger. These guys, they didn't clean up the crowd for 2 days. Why did they start to slide again? In this regard, Luo Xian didn't care at all. Looking at him burning the books, she was full of joy. What a pity, I could have seen the confession just now. She sighed. Huaishe, you need to give her some courage. Huaishe was silent in shame for a long time. Sister Xian, won't you be angry? Yes. Luo Xian answered without hesitation. Although the prince belongs to everyone, if he doesn't belong to me, I'll be unhappy. Huaishe, if you tell me that you fell in love with someone else, I'll definitely be sad. Jealousy, possessiveness, selfishness, and hopeless greed. She thought for a moment, as if she had no choice, and said frankly, because I'm such a terrible woman. No, senior. Huaishe corrected. So, don't do anything that makes me sad, Huaishe. She reached out and pinched Huaishe's face again. She touched it gently and touched it again. Otherwise, I'll definitely cry very badly. At that time, will you still like me when I show my ugly side? Huaishe shook his head and told her seriously, no matter what you become, you will never change in my heart. Luo Xian laughed. What if I become a bad person? What if I become someone you hate? It won't happen. Huaishe replied flatly, I'm here. You're always so reassuring, Huaishe. She narrowed her eyes, not bothering to hide her happiness. I like it when you say that. Because I trust you, Huaishe said. Then, please trust me a little more, rely on me a little more, and like me a little more. She stared at Huaishe and gently pleaded, take more today than yesterday, and the same tomorrow. In this way, I won't be afraid. Her long hair fluttered in the sea breeze, and her eyes shone like stars rising from the ocean. As long as you're still looking at me, I'll definitely stay in your world. I'll stay on the side where you belong. But, what if I'm not qualified to bear such a responsibility, Sister Xian? Huaishe lowered his eyes in shame. Except for squandering my cheap love, I haven't done anything for you. Instead, I've asked for a lot from you, haven't I? Then please take more and rely on me more until you can't leave me. Luo Xian smiled mischievously, as if her conspiracy had succeeded. Even if you feel guilty, you can't give up. This may be the obligation of a prince. After all, I'm already by your side. Even if there is no agreement, I will not let this matter rest. Please be prepared. It sounds really scary. Huaishe leaned on the bench and sighed with relief. Fortunately, I'm not easy to deal with. Only at times like this, you don't look like a prince. Times have changed. Huaishe looked back at her. After a short silence, the two of them laughed together. In this soft afternoon, Huaishe felt the wind in the distance and gradually relaxed. He listened to the bells in the city behind him. Where are we going next? He asked. Maybe we can go to India. This time, we may really go to the deepest part of Sanlian City, Luo Xian said. I want to take back the things my father and mother left there. Where's Elder Luo? Huai Shi asked. I didn't see him last time. He just left a note and disappeared. He can't have gone to hell to start a class, right? Father. Luo Xian thought for a moment and said, he probably wants to take revenge for his mother and for himself. It used to be the focus of India's genealogy, the holy land of destruction, Kavanasi. It used to be a place favored by the gods. Now, under the guidance of the Pied Piper, it had fallen into the abyss, leaving only wreckage. Its real body had fallen into the deepest part of Sanlian City in hell, and it was sealed with all its strength by the maintenance of the genealogy. It was the place where Luo Siwei once used his supreme, which symbolized absolute violence, to send his crazy teacher to hell. The collapse of the world in the past had long been buried in heavy dust. Huai Shi had never asked about the details. Even if he asked, Elder Luo would probably not tell him. The pain that was once engraved in that person's body could not be removed no matter how cruel the training and ascetic practices were. After losing everything, towards hell, towards the initiator of all this, there was only hatred that could not be dispelled no matter how noble and holy the Dharma was. After Huai Shi had resolved his last concern, there was only one goal left in his life: to completely destroy the element of destruction known as the Pied Piper with this pair of iron fists that had once broken the 6 paths of reincarnation. Although he did not know what kind of deal he made with the Continuation Academy, he was afraid that participating in the battle against Boxuan was just a rehearsal for his revenge. However, there's still no need to worry. Luo Xian waved her hand. Father is not someone who doesn't know what's important. He's already so old, he won't be as hot-blooded as a young man who doesn't care about anything. He must have his own plans and plans. As the younger generation, there's no need for us to worry blindly. Even so, I still can't help but have a headache. Huai Shi rubbed his face. He felt that the people he knew seemed to have bigger ambitions and bigger goals than the other. On the other hand, he was simply a salted fish, immersed in the joy of counting money every day and unable to extricate himself. There was no cure for him. Just as they were chatting, time passed. Bit by bit. Until far away, on the passenger ship, the whistle sounded for the 3rd time, but the request to leave the port never received a reply from the dispatch center. They waited blankly in place. It seems that I have to go, Huai Shi. Luo Xian said. If this goes on, everyone will be impatient. Huai Shi was silent and said softly, actually, you can rest for another day. What about tomorrow? Will the ship continue to stay tomorrow? The day after tomorrow? The day after tomorrow? Luo Xian looked at him and couldn't help but smile. Of course, if you want to violently lock me up and lock me up in your house, I will definitely cooperate. But will you do that? Huai Shi smiled bitterly and shook his head. So disappointing. I was looking forward to it. You really don't understand a girl's heart at all. Luo Xian smiled and reached out to pull him up from the chair. Once again, she said, then, let's settle for the next best thing. Before we say goodbye, can you give me a hug, Huai Shi? With that, she opened her arms and said expectantly, even if it's me, I will need the prince to give me strength. Anytime, Sister Xian. Huai Shi reached out and hugged her gently, feeling her breath blowing past his ear. Luo Xian closed her eyes slightly and felt the warmth close by. She chuckled softly. There is someone else's smell in the hug. Can I be angry? Yes. Huai Shi nodded. It doesn't matter if you are furious. Then, accept the punishment. She picked up Huai Shi's face, not allowing him to dodge or escape. She leaned close, kissed his cheek, and then bit it hard. After a long time, she finally let go of her hand. She took a step back. Looking at Huai Shi's dull look, the corners of her mouth curled up slightly. She smiled proudly. Please remember me, Huai Shi. She reached out and touched the wound on Huai Shi's face. Please leave your smell here. Just like that, she picked up her luggage, took the things she had taken away, and turned to leave. Only Huai was left in a daze in the wind. After a long time, he slumped in the chair. He forgot to breathe. In the evening, in the tea-house of the airport, Ai Qing raised her head and looked at a certain someone who was fidgeting opposite her. You seem to be in a mess. Her gaze swept from the needle hole on Huai's collar, to the wrinkles on his shirt, to the wound on his face that the silver blood band-aid could not cover, and to his messy hair that had been turned into a mess after running all the way here. It's like, she thought for a moment and said jokingly, after being robbed by robbers, then attacked by fanatical fans, and after being bitten, you still have to face a storm. Probably? Huai panted. When he saw the bottled water on the table, his eyes suddenly lit up. He took it and began to drink it in one gulp. In short, it's a long story, he added, holding the empty bottle. Well, I can see that. Ai Qing glanced at his distracted look, stirring the black tea in the cup with the slender spoon in her hand. It's the first time I've drunk a bottle of water with someone else. Huai was stunned for a moment. He looked down at the bottle in his hand, subconsciously let go, picked it up again, and finally carefully put the bottle back on the table. After hesitating for a moment, he put the bottle cap aside. He put it straight, sat up straight. Oh, but I bought that bottle and haven't touched it yet. Don't worry, Ai Qing added as if she had just remembered something. Seeing Huai heave a sigh of relief, she comforted him. Don't worry, I didn't bring a gun. I won't steal anything from you, or hug or kiss you. Huai was petrified in the chair, stunned. Are you going to start talking about that well-known theory again? Ai Qing said indifferently, don't worry. As we all know, in addition to being rich and lunatics, madmen and idealists, the most common people in the Republic are scumbags who like to cheat on several women. Compared to your predecessors, well, in terms of numbers and progress, you can be said to be conservative and harmless. Of course, it could also be because you prefer to pursue. She thought for a moment and found a word. Quality? In broad daylight, President AI, you can't talk nonsense. Huai subconsciously grabbed the handkerchief on the table and wiped the cold sweat on his face. After wiping it, he was about to say, how can you people from the Directorate of Defense accuse me of innocence without any evidence? Only then did he realize that his handkerchief seemed to belong to the person across the table. Moreover, she seemed to have placed the handkerchief in a convenient position early in the morning. It was convenient to access. It's night now, Huai. There will be a thunderstorm later, and you won't even be able to see the stars. So, there's no such thing as broad daylight, Huai. Ai Qing crossed her hands on the table and told him bluntly, also, as your former boss, even if I'm your current boss, I have no right to tell you how to make friends. Of course, there may be some close relationship between us that isn't clear, but this doesn't stop you from choosing your own life. After all, the relationship between the Directorate of Defense and Celestial Genealogy is complicated now. Whether it's for public or private reasons, both of us should be clear about our positions and ensure that we won't give the wrong signal to outsiders because of our identities. You don't have to worry or be afraid. She picked up the cup of black tea and took a sip. I'm just saying this to tell you to relax. I won't shoot you or anything like that. Speaking of which, your reactions for the past 2 days have been quite interesting, especially when you're playing cards. It's really delightful. Huai was in a daze. Ai Qing was puzzled. Is there anything you want to say? Huai was still in a daze. Holding the handkerchief in his hand, he just wanted to wipe his tears. You've already said it, what else can I say? He stuttered for a long time, trying to observe her expression, but Ai Qing's expression was as calm as ever. He couldn't see anything. He could only ask tentatively, have you eaten? If you don't know what to say, you don't have to find something to say. It'll be very awkward. Ai Qing glanced at his complicated expression and raised the corner of her eyes slightly. Before this time, I thought that the person sitting in front of me would be a boring moral specimen. I didn't expect to see you so lively." She paused for a moment and added, "Well, except that your connections are a little more than expected, there doesn't seem to be any problem." Huaishur was silent for a long time. He opened his mouth several times, wanting to say something. In the end, he could only sigh softly. "I'm sorry to let you see me like this. It's true that you're unreasonable." Ai Qing nodded and agreed. "You didn't do anything, but you look guilty. It hurts my eyes. However, I think it's good to be like this." She looked at the dazed man in front of her, recalled the past memory, and sighed with emotion. It's much better than the half-dead look in the past. He was always dejected with tears in his eyes. He looked like he was about to cry in the next moment, but he didn't say anything. He couldn't get up from the mud, but he pretended to be happy with himself, holding an expression that he was very good and happy. Also, he would throw everything to the back of his mind at the drop of a hat. He would do whatever he liked, and the messy results that came out of it because of his personality. No matter which one it was very annoying. But no matter which one it was inseparable from the man in front of her. However, he was no longer the dispirited figure that he remembered in the past. He seemed to have become stronger and more distant. "You've grown up, Huaishur," she whispered softly. Huaishur looked up. He didn't hear it clearly. "Nothing." Ai Qing shook her head, took out 2 documents from the open briefcase beside her, and pushed them over the table. "Take a look and sign it." After that, she held her chin and didn't say anything else. She just looked at Huaishur, waiting for his reply. Being stared at like that, he couldn't help but tremble. He lowered his head and flipped through it carefully. He was afraid that it would be a record of him messing around with some young lady, or evidence of him committing crimes that were finally exposed to the public, or traces of him colluding with the dark forces of hell to conspire against the law. Fortunately, he didn't have any of these. So, it was none of them. The first one was the observation record written by Ai Qing. It recorded in detail the operation of the ivory tower, the talents and experience of the main members, and even the process of Huaishur's guidance. It didn't mention anything that was irrelevant. It was objective, fair, and there was not a single word of falsehood. Even with Huaishur's skills in writing official documents, he couldn't see any errors. It was terrifying. Now, all that was needed was for Huaishur to personally sign and confirm that everything described in it was true. Then, it could be sealed and sent to the decision-making room for filing. And the second one, it was a strange document that even the first party's organization was smeared. The terms were detailed and complicated. After Huaishur read the beginning, he began to scroll down and found that there were more than 10 pages, and when he looked up, Confidential Operation Commissioner Employment Contract? Huaishur scratched his head and couldn't understand. "What's this?" "It's the contract," Ai Qing replied. "For some reasons that I can't tell others, apart from the overhead floor, I'm now working in a department that I can't tell others about. I often have to carry out some tasks and actions that I can't tell others about. Sometimes, for some reasons that I can't tell others about, I need you to be a tool to do some things that I can't tell others about, and to ensure that no one can tell others about the final result. Of course, I will ensure that your tasks and actions will not harm your own position and celestial genealogy. You just need to provide some help at the right time." A series of words seemed to be more confusing than the terms on the contract. Huaishur was confused. She lowered her head and looked at the contract in her hand. Then, she carefully glanced at Ai Qing's face. After making sure that she wasn't unhappy or gloomy, she asked, "Can you make it simpler?" "Indenture contract," Ai Qing said concisely. "Phew, you scared me to death." Huaishur breathed a sigh of relief and patted his chest. "I thought you were going to rob me of my eggs." Taking out the indenture contract was like taking out a divorce agreement. Huaishur's heart was beating wildly. He signed his name at the back and handed it over. But Ai Qing didn't accept it. She just looked at him. Are you sure, Huai Shi? Ai Qing said solemnly. You still have plenty of time to hesitate before I take this document back. But once I put it in the box, it's very likely that you will die at some point in the future, at some place, because of my orders, in a way that no one will ever know. Your family, your friends, and your colleagues won't receive anything except the notice of your death. Huai Shi was stunned. Is it that dangerous? It's even more dangerous than that. Ai Qing said, You should know that I don't like to exaggerate. Oh, then it's okay. I'm used to it. Huai Shi shook his head. Besides, if you need me, I can't just stand by and watch, right? Ai Qing was silent. She didn't say anything else. She just looked at Huai Shi with a gaze that made his hair stand on end. After a long, long time, she reached out and took the contract. For a moment, she seemed to want to say something. But in the end, she still remained silent. She just closed the box in her hand. Then, official business is done. I should go. She said softly, Take care, Huai Shi. Okay. Huai Shi nodded and got up. Take care and... in this short pause, he thought of a lot of words to say to her, but in the end he couldn't say it. He didn't know where she was going, and he didn't know what she was going to face. In the end, he could only repeat dejectedly, Take care. Okay. Ai Qing nodded. Before she left, she looked at Huai Shi, who was still standing behind her. Her footsteps paused slightly. Next time, take me around here. Okay. Huai Shi nodded and didn't hesitate. Anytime, anywhere. Then, she seemed to smile, but it couldn't be seen clearly in the reflection of the glass. He could only see her pass through the ticket gate and disappear at the end of the covered bridge. Huai Shi stood in place for a long time, watching the special plane of the Central Command take off and disappear into the dark clouds in the distance. He squeezed the empty water bottle in his hand. He turned around and left. Miss Ai, do you need dinner? Under the dim light, the crew bent down and asked softly. No need. I want to take a nap, Ai Qing said. Just remind me before we land. Okay. The crew nodded and finally said, This flight will take 4 hours. The final landing point is Shiqing at the border of Dongxia. During the process, there may be unstable airflow due to the thunderstorm. Please be careful. So, after closing the door for her, the footsteps faded away. Ai Qing sat on the chair and silently looked at the distant stars outside the window. It was as if she could still see the person who was overlooking everything from behind the window in the departure hall. After a long time, she closed the curtains. She put on an eye mask and began to rest. However, as soon as she closed her eyes, she heard a slight vibration in her pocket. After skipping the blocked list, it directly transmitted a call. She frowned, picked up the phone expressionlessly, and answered the call. Hello, hello. On the other end of the phone, there was an excited voice. Oh, my good friend Radar suddenly found out that you're coming to Dongxia. Treat me to a meal. In the Jinling branch, a certain someone in a brand new office proudly spun around in the chair twice. Okay. I love you so much. Like you love every rich guy who treats you to a meal? Ai Qing sneered. But I also love every rich guy equally. Chai Fei replied very innocently. They don't love my appearance or heart, they just love my position and information, so why can't I love their money? Of course, that's just for show. When the time comes, you just need to bring yourself and your credit card. Ai Qing was indifferent and didn't speak. Chai Fei seemed to smell something unusual and became more curious. What's wrong? You seem to be very irritated? I'm thinking about something. Ai Qing replied coldly. I don't want to be disturbed by someone, so can I trouble you to hang up the phone? Aya, she's so cold. She's definitely my best friend. Chai Fei became more and more enthusiastic. So serious? I'm very curious. I really want to know. What kind of conspiracy and plan is making you so troubled? You've only worked on the overhead floor for a few months, and you're already planning to change your leader? Ms. X's work ability is flawless, and her achievements and character are unquestionable. If you want to pry into internal information, you don't have to. AI Ching said straightforwardly. It's just a very simple multiple-choice question. Say. I want to hear. Chai Fei shouted. I love to hear this. I want to hear it. AI Ching didn't say anything. She didn't urge her again. She was waiting for something in silence. Until AI Ching spoke again, calm and cold. Have you been to the garden? Chai Fei, have you ever liked a certain flower in particular? Well, although I don't really understand, it's similar to the roast duck in the restaurant, right? Maybe. AI Ching thought for a moment and continued. Sometimes you care about a certain flower. You think it's very exquisite and beautiful. Unfortunately, the color and type don't match you. The land it grows on is not in your home. The climate you love will only be destroyed by it. So, you'll feel that it's best to keep a little distance. There's no need to be selfish. If you can appreciate it, it's not bad to stay in the garden. Even if you miss it, you can come back to see it often. Yes. Chai Fei seemed to be nodding, and then you find, AI Ching said, there are too many people in the garden. Such calm words made Chai Fei's smile stiffen. She subconsciously held her breath. She didn't speak again. After a long time, she heard a faint whisper on the other end of the phone. Since everyone wants to move it back home, why can't that person be me? Chapter 1095. Late at night, Huai Shi pushed open the door of the Stone Marrow restaurant expressionlessly. In the living room, Fang Shu turned around. Young master, do you want to have some supper? No, Fang Shu, you should rest. You've worked hard these past 2 days. Huai Shi took off his coat and hung it on the hanger. He suddenly turned around and asked, Where is Tangyi? In the lounge. The old man replied, She seems to have been waiting for you for a long time. It looks like you have something to say. I'll get a pot of mint tea for you too. He thought for a moment and asked, Do you want some cookies? Yes, thank you. Huai Shi nodded and walked straight to the lounge. He pushed open the door in front of him roughly. He saw the figure slumped on the sofa, surrounded by fries, shrimp chips, and a lot of snacks. She was still holding a pot of fried chicken and watching TV attentively. When she noticed Huai Shi coming in, she picked up the remote control and turned off the TV. Huai Shi only had time to hear a familiar voice on the TV saying, Why can't it be me? He frowned and looked at the dark screen. What are you watching? The TV. Tangyi wiped the potato chip residue from the corner of her mouth and introduced excitedly, It's the popular evening drama 24 Hours of the Scumbag. The plot is full of ups and downs. There are knives and sugar. The structure is tight. Although the protagonist is a scumbag, people can't help but be immersed in it. They both hope that he can be chopped, and they also hope that he can get away with it. Well, although both sides seem to have a lot of support, I'm in the middle. With that, she invited, How about it? Do you want to join in the viewing? Be an actress? Huai Shi sneered and sat opposite her. He asked directly, Who's the director? Are you? This. Tangyi blinked innocently and seemed embarrassed. I can't deny that I have a little effect, but you can't blame me for it, right? Bang. The table suddenly shook. Huai Shi no longer hid his anger and unhappiness. That's too much, Tangyi. Tangyi was puzzled and asked, How is it too much? Did I eat your fries? I'll make another one for you later. Don't be angry. You know what I'm talking about, Tangyi. You know why I'm angry. Huai Shi asked coldly, I know you like to tease me and see me in a sorry state. But even if you want to see me make a fool of myself, there's no need to involve them, right? A joke? Tangyi shook her head nonchalantly. That's not right, Huai Shi. This is something you'll have to face sooner or later. Oh, I'm just helping you to, bring them forward? Tangyi, Huai Shi interrupted her coldly. All right. Tangyi raised her hand and interrupted him before he really got angry. She got up from the sofa and leaned forward with a smile. Why sure, let's talk about something serious. She raised her hand and snapped her fingers. The crisp sound spread out, dispelling the cicadas outside the window, the insects in the night, the electric current in the electronic equipment, and even all the insignificant noise. Everything returned to silence. Only the sound of Huaishi's breathing could be heard. And Tangi, holding her chin, asked as if she was joking, "Can you recall, how long has it been since you talked to me like this?" Huaishi frowned. "What do you mean?" "It's the literal meaning, Huaishi." Tangi asked with a faint smile. "How long has it been since you expressed your joy and anger directly? How long has it been since you looked back on yourself? And how long has it been since you acted like a normal person like this?" "Am I not normal?" Huaishi asked back. "Or do you think I'm sick and need treatment?" "It's not necessarily that you're sick, but it's not completely normal, right?" Tangi looked at him and sighed with pity. "A normal person won't live like a hero in a storybook. Huaishi, selfless, generous, and passionate, shining in the light. It's true that everything is magnificent and desirable, but even a prince has to go to the toilet, Huaishi. Except for a mule that has eaten too much dye, no one can poop out pink balls." She spread out her hands and asked helplessly, "Can you recall how long you've been in this state?" Huaishi was at a loss. He wanted to refute, but he didn't know where to start. He didn't know when it started, but he seemed to have gradually entered the role that everyone imagined. Justice, mercy, strength, selflessness, and invulnerability. He was like a hero of steel who had descended to the mortal world, bringing salvation and relief. In front of his students, he was a generous teacher. In the celestial genealogy, he was a perfect example. In everyone's eyes, he was the successor of the Republic. He represented everything that was about to rise and the glory of his return. "But isn't this good?" "Of course it's good, Huaishi. There's nothing wrong with this, is there?" Tangi smiled. On her slender fingers, the teacup was lifted and rotated under a subtle balance. The white porcelain and gold rim glowed with a gentle light. "But in the end, where did this change come from?" she asked doubtfully. "Is what you're pursuing your own compassion, or the compassion bestowed by the heavens? Are you controlling your own desires or the rules of divinity? Are you the young man who once yearned for happiness, or the hero in everyone's dreams? Do you achieve all this from the bottom of your heart, or are you a moral specimen, as Ai Ching said?" Tangi looked up and asked solemnly. "Are you Huaishi or Yun Zhongjuan?" "Aren't I both?" Huaishi retorted without hesitation. "Aren't all these things created by me, Tangi? As long as there is growth, it must be different from the past. Or do I have to be like how I was in the past? This is also falling into another extreme, Huaishi." Tangi chuckled. "Nothing is constant. It's just that sometimes the change may not be as you expect, and it may not be the result of your love. The abundance of divinity will make you love everyone, but among the many virtues, only love must be different. In the end, it will be inconvenient for you to love anyone. Perhaps everyone will love you, but in the end, everyone will fall in love with the hero, and no one will love Huaishi. Admittedly, you are doing very well now, but you must distinguish the duties and image given to you by the outside world from your true desires and love. You must understand where you are." She paused for a moment, and there was disappointment and helplessness in her eyes. "If you let it go, you will be immersed in the glory and solemnity of divinity, day after day, until one day, you will completely forget your former side as an ordinary person and eventually become a ruthless and correct machine, or a tool dominated by fate. I have seen such things too many times." In a short silence, Huaishi was stunned. However, his years of experience of being arranged and fooled reminded him that this seemed to be the truth, but there seemed to be something wrong. Immediately, he slammed the table angrily. "But what does this have to do with you torturing me?" "Oh? Don't you understand? Tongi laughed. I just want some people to remind you who you are. Is that so? Huaishe glanced at her coldly. Yes, yes. Tongi nodded seriously with an innocent face, as if she was full of bitterness and helplessness that could not be understood, and she was full of sadness and melancholy. Huaishe quietly watched her performance, unmoved. Why do I feel that you are just looking for fun? Oh, Tongi's smile became shy. She raised her thumb and index finger and gestured. Of course, I can't deny that a small part of it is because of this. But other than them, who can knock you out of that glorious and magnificent shell and restore the original appearance of that fool, Huaishe? Your past, your present, and your future, Tongi said. Before you became an Ascended One, and after you became an Ascended One, they have all witnessed everything of you. Huaishe, you have to face them, just like you have to face your former self. She paused for a moment, and her expression became subtle. So far, your life will be a life spent with them, won't it? Huaishe's expression twitched and twitched again. He began to have a headache, but he was speechless, unable to refute, and did not know how to deal with it. It was precisely because of this that he felt angry, towards Tongi. No, it should be towards himself. What if it causes irreparable consequences, Tongi? Huaishe sighed helplessly. If they are hurt because of this, what should I do? Will there really be irreparable consequences? Tongi asked in surprise. Don't tell me you think that they'll be jealous of each other like in the harem novels. They'll be jealous of each other and fight so hard that they'll act out a house fight in front of you? Come on, Huaishe. What era is it now? What kind of people are they? Tongi counted with her fingers in front of him. She started off as an inspector and slowly made her way to the core of the Directorate of Command, becoming a key figure in the elevated floor, and even closer to becoming a creature of power with a secret mission. She was loved by humans and the abyss, a princess who had both the seed of solidification and sublimation. A real person born out of nothingness, the future king of the dark net, the controller and creator of events and records. There was also a silent person who was loved by this world and the silver ocean. Even if you really have a harem and big queen, you can't accommodate any one of them. The so-called love may be important, but it can't restrain their footsteps, and can't make them your caged birds. Even if there really comes a day when they find that the conflict between them can't be resolved, they won't use the so-called mutual harm to solve the problem. And they won't be so stupid as to expect your pity and favor. This is no longer something you can interfere in. If you ask me, a guy like you who is overcautious won't be of much use at all. Don't overestimate yourself. At most, you'll be like a pot of flowers placed in a garden and moved around. At most, well, you'll just be a trophy. Tongi thought for a moment and noticed Huaishe's gradually paling face. She comforted him and said, Think on the bright side, maybe everyone can reach an agreement and divide you into 4 equal parts, right? When the time comes, one piece will be here, one piece will be there, one piece will be here, one piece will be there, one piece will be there. Problem solved. How can this be solved? Huaishe was furious. They're all dead. This is the problem you have to face, Huaishe. Tongi spread her hands sympathetically. This is your own choice. If you had just flirted a little less, you wouldn't have ended up in such a tragic state. Since you enjoy more than 4 times the love, you must pay 4 times the price. Dividing into 4 equal parts is already very simple, however, that's many years in the future. You haven't even reached the legal age for marriage, so why worry so much? Yes. Huaishe was stunned for a long time, and then he subconsciously breathed a sigh of relief. Then, he realized that he had been tricked by this black-hearted woman again. He was furious. Are you still fooling me? No. Tongi was puzzled. Didn't I explain everything clearly? But if, Huaishe was silent for a moment. Although he knew that it was impossible, he couldn't help but ask, what if I'm terminally ill? What if they can't make me return to normal? Look at what you're saying. Tongi held her chin and laughed. Don't you still have me? Her confidence made Huaishur even angrier. What will you use? He snorted. I'm not so easy to deal with, Tongi. People grow. Use money? Use beauty? Money is like dirt to me, and women are like floating clouds to me. You don't think your so-called benefits will work, do you? No, there's no need to go through so much trouble. Tongi raised her hand and pulled out a solemn book from the void. Of course I'll use this, Huaishur. She paused for a moment and revealed an expectant smile. The book of fate that's filled with your dark history. At that moment, Huaishur felt as if he had fallen into an ice cave. His eyes widened in a daze. He reached out to stop her, but it was too late. Maybe you can't understand it just by describing it, so let's try it first. Tongi picked it up, flipped through 2 pages, and nodded. Let's start with the background of the fantasy novel you wrote when you were 9. By the way, in the Heaven Drive continent, music is king. The poor young man Zhou and his sister rely on each other. Oh, did you have a sister complex at that time? It doesn't matter. Look at this setting, look at this plot. It's really full of ups and downs. It's amazing. How about we spend money to make a comic? In the future, maybe the animation will become a hit. Enough, don't say any more. Huaishur covered his head with both hands. He was so embarrassed that he wanted to dig a hole and bury himself in it. His whole body was trembling, and tears were streaming down his face. Are you a human? Of course not. Tongji had a smug expression on her face that said, I have no conscience. Don't worry, I've already prepared more than a dozen copies for you in advance, including all the stupid things you've done since you were young, as well as the unspeakable desires and fantasies you had for the ladies in your heart back then, as well as those sweet dreams that made people blush. Once you begin to deviate from human nature to divinity, I'll use your money to hire your people to help you change everything and create a big IP. I'll guarantee that every one of your fans, and every animation, novel, and movie enthusiast in the present realm will have a copy. Great sage, quickly withdraw your divine power. I was wrong, okay? Huaishur collapsed on the chair. Just imagining such a future made his tears uncontrollably rush out. Compared to such an outcome, he would rather be divided into 4 classes. At least he would die with a clear conscience. Don't worry, I know you're very touched. You don't have to thank me, this is what I should do. Tongji stroked his hair with relief and said gently, After all, from the day you sign the contract, I have to be responsible for you for the rest of your life, don't you think so? According to the terms of the contract, you and I will share glory, power, crown, and authority. This includes, and is not limited to, life, soul, and even everything. She paused for a moment, and her tone became meaningful. In other words? Huaishur looked up in confusion. Then, he saw her face right in front of him, and his own reflection in her eyes that were faintly glowing. A pair of slightly cold and slender hands cupped his cheek. When he was least prepared for it. He opened his mouth to speak, but no sound came out. A soft touch covered his lips. It was so warm and gentle, like a fog full of joy. It broke into his consciousness, shook his reason, shook his soul, and even made him forget everything. Even if it was only for a short moment. A touch and they separated. In other words, you are my private property, Huaishur. Tongi whispered in his ear softly, only on this point you have no other choice. After that, she slowly raised her head, tucked the stray hair in front of her forehead behind her ear, and happily looked down at Huaishur's stiff and dull face, and told him, Don't ever forget. In this way, she waved goodbye, hummed a song, and briskly walked away with small and fragmented dance steps. Only Huaishur was left in the same place, petrified. He forgot his soul. After a long time, when he finally reacted, he subconsciously raised his hand to cover his mouth, and couldn't help but tremble with anger. His pure body, his innocence, his integrity for so many years, was taken away by that black-hearted woman in such a despicable way when he was least prepared. Thinking of this, his tears finally flowed down. My first kiss, and just outside the door behind him, Tongi, who had returned, poked her head out and kindly reminded him, "Oh, by the way, don't feel too bad about your first kiss. After all, you haven't had that kind of thing for a long time." As she spoke, she blinked and raised her finger to draw the outline of a bird's beak, reminding Huai Shi of her unbearable past, as well as her dark past of being toyed with by this woman, and the cruel future where he would be played for many years. "Good night," she winked at Huai Shi and disappeared behind the door. Only Huai Shi was left sitting alone in the quiet lounge. His mind was empty. He didn't sleep all night. Chapter 1096. Teacher? Early in the morning, in front of the office door, Yuan looked at the back of the figure in the chair in astonishment. "Are you okay?" "Yes." Huai Shi turned back. "What's wrong? Am I not doing well?" Yuan did not speak. She was speechless. Under the faint morning sun, the lonely figure sat in the chair, as if looking at the scenery outside the window, gazing into the distance in the dust. But his line of sight was not focused, but fell on an empty place. They had not seen each other for just one night, but he seemed to have experienced the vicissitudes of life. When he turned back and forced a smile, Yuan felt the sadness and melancholy from the bottom of her heart. Her heart could not help but twist into a ball. In just 2 days, her teacher seemed to have suffered a great blow. He changed from a high-spirited navigator to what he was today. How could she, as a student, not feel sad? Did something happen? Yuan asked uneasily. "Yes, a lot of things happened, a lot of things." Huai Shi shook his head, wiping the red corners of his eyes. "And some things, once lost, can never come back." The turbid tears were no longer clear. It was as if the years of youth had gone forever. The young man who kept his chastity had passed away in the silent night. From then on, only a rough life of being played in the palm of the black-hearted woman was left. In the sigh and lament, he could not help but imagine his tragic future. Perhaps very soon, Tong Ji would tear apart the gentle disguise that she had been putting on all this time. Her beastly nature would erupt, and she would extend her evil demonic hands towards her. Then, she would be locked up and forced to do all kinds of unspeakable things. She would be allowed to do whatever she wanted. Just like that, she would spend her life in mediocrity, doing nothing until she was 70 or 80 years old. Wait, why did it feel so exciting when he thought of it? He was stunned for a long time and shook his head crazily. He could not think about it anymore. If he thought about it again, he would also decline. "Ahem, it's just a small matter, don't mention it." In Yuan's sluggish eyes, he tried hard to hide the strange smile subconsciously at the corner of his mouth and asked seriously, "What's the matter? Why are you here so early?" I thought that teacher would also rest today." Although Yuan didn't know what was going on, she was still shocked. She tried hard to find the right words to describe her teacher's slacking behavior. In the end, she raised the document in her hand and said, "So, I thought, if I came earlier, I could do more." Huai Shi was stunned for a long time. He was so moved that he wanted to cry. What does it mean to be untainted by mud? After being persecuted by his heartless teacher for so long, he still woke up early and went to bed late every day to work diligently. He wasn't afraid of hardship or tiredness, doing the work of 10 people all by himself. Furthermore, he even had to clean up his mess every few days. He was simply the reincarnation of the vice-principal's spirit, the future pillar of the ivory tower. Even Huai Shi couldn't help but feel a little guilty at this moment. He let out a long sigh and reflected on his laziness during this period of time. Then, he took all the documents from Yuan. How could he continue to persecute such a good student? Occasionally, he had to deal with it himself. 2 hours later, Huai Shi, who was dizzy, raised his head and looked at the documents that seemed to have increased in height. He wanted to say something but stopped on second thought. He began to doubt his life. Next to him, Yuan secretly sighed that her teacher had persisted for so long this time. He was really amazing. She obediently reached out and took away a large part of the document. Then, she added a pot of tea for him. Soon, with far more efficiency than her teacher, she finished all the work except for signing and stamping. Then, she put back the documents that were reduced to less than 1/10 of the thickness. I will sort out this part of the report first. After teacher has checked the results and found that there is no problem, you can submit it for approval. Ahem, in that case, don't do this next time. Huaishur had completely forgotten the solemn vow she had made just now. She let her take the documents away with a helpless look on her face. He began to drink tea. As the saying goes, when the teacher has something to do, the disciple will do the work. How could it be persecuted when the student helped the teacher with his work? Wasn't this natural? He was just training her ability. How could she not want to work? Huaishur sat next to her and drank tea. He watched his student work hard and felt emotional. What do you mean by the teacher's sweet little jacket? In contrast, the guy in the cabin in the woods was too unrestrained. Every day, he went between the dojo and the Doomsday campus. He didn't do anything serious. He only thought about going to his girlfriend's house for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. Huaishur looked down and found that there was a missed call from that guy on his phone. He must be planning to ask for leave again. He couldn't help but shake his head. I'll add more work later. How can I be the successor of celestial genealogy if I don't have enough work? In fact, he didn't have so much work to do originally. Now, most of the official business in the ivory tower was handled by the teaching and research office. Finally, it was decided by the vice principal. Huaishur only needed to be responsible for the matters of the Doomsday campus. Most of the work could be left to other people. He didn't need to worry at all. With his current reputation and status in the Doomsday campus, did he still need to worry about being taken advantage of by others? The only thing that kept him busy recently was the foundry center that had just been built at the headquarters of the ivory tower. The department was in the initial stage. Except for the tools sent from Dongsha, America, and Rome, there was not enough manpower. And the only real foundry was Huaishur. Especially the students sent to the training class, they had to leave after the expiration of the training class. They couldn't be used for a long time at all. He could only poach a few students from the alchemy classroom as seedlings for intensive training. Compared to this newly formed team, there were so many things to deal with that there was no end to it. In this regard, Huaishur could only say, "Too much money, so annoying." Ever since he broke through to rank 4 and became Yun Zhongjuan, he showed off in front of the whole world how terrifying the explosive production of casting techniques could be. There began to be a large number of orders for relics from the border like snowflakes. Every day, there were countless people holding bills of lading at the entrance of the foundry center, wanting to block him. It couldn't be helped. Alchemy products were an out-and-out seller's market. The scarcity of alchemists and the production of their products determined the high price of this thing. It was common to line up for an order for 3 years. However, this was the high-end market. It was particular about tailor-made and absolute fit, as well as minimizing the negative effects brought by relics from the border to the greatest extent. But the low-end market never cared about this. If there was money, it would be sold. But the problem was, most of them were used by apprentices for practice. If they bought something back, not to mention using it a few times, it might even cause problems if it was placed there as a decoration for a long time. It was not that the major workshops did not have a stable quantity of products, but a stable output had a stable supply agreement. Those products had all been taken into the pockets of the major families, plutocrats, and families before they were even out of the furnace. If one wanted to cut the queue, they either had to have enough face or enough money. The market was always in a state of unsaturated hunger. Moreover, at this critical juncture of the War of the Worlds, who didn't want to have more reserves? At this time, Huai Shi's preciousness was reflected. A single person could produce the same output as an entire large alchemy workshop in a whole year without doing anything. Even if that was the effect of the correction value, in fact, the quantity and productivity were reduced by half. In particular, he had a complete set of mainstream weapons like swords, spears, swords, halberds, hatchets, hooks, and forks. Moreover, he was backed by the Imperial Academy and had countless Tongyi's tools at his disposal, supporting high-end customization. Moreover, Huai Shi's technology of activating and repairing precious relics was unparalleled in the entire realm. No one could learn it even if they wanted to. Naturally, the market competitiveness was frighteningly high. Even the Stone Cauldron Association's commissioner repeatedly considered Huai Shi after walking around a few times. If it weren't for the fact that he didn't have any foundation in the Stone Cauldron Association and was biased to the extreme, and that he had the lives of 2 great grandmasters in his hands, he would have been able to get a nomination for the Great Grandmaster evaluation at the end of next year. In short, as the Ascender who had single-handedly opened the curtains of the War of the Worlds, Huai Shi had not only been in the limelight, but also won countless praises, and even hatred and jealousy. His biggest gain was that his business was surprisingly good. Never in her wildest dreams would Huai Shi have imagined that she would one day become rich because of an arms dealer. Of course, just like how the streamers were all supported by big brothers, although there were many individual investors, they didn't constitute a quantity. If one wanted to become rich, they had to rely on windfalls. And in addition to the large number of individual investors and orders from more than a dozen large enterprises, the one who ranked above all the customers was one of the current 5 pillars, Huai Shi's old friend. Eastern Summer Genealogy. In this business, Diding, who came to participate in the negotiation as a representative, was too lazy to talk about the conditions. It vividly displayed 4 words: rich and overbearing. The settlement equivalents were not limited to Eastern Summer Yuan, origin crystals, the copper essence of Mount Shouyang, and even the herbal medicine inventory of Mount Yu Dai. As long as the ivory tower opened its mouth, anything was negotiable, even if it was a premium to offset the loan. As for the goods, there were no other requirements at all. As long as there was something, they would accept it. There was no limit to the grade, as long as it was a relic from the border. There was no limit to the quality, as long as it could be used, there was no problem. There was no limit to the effect, even if it was an iron rod with a blade, they would still pay the bill. There was no need to say so many useless things, just a simple sentence. Take the money, give me the goods. It was as if it had gone crazy. It was unknown whether it was because it was sure that Huai Shi wouldn't ask for too much or just make up the numbers. In short, Xian Niao only had one sentence: the more, the better. Huai Shi was so scared that he tossed and turned for several days, not understanding what exactly Xian Niao was selling. It couldn't be that it had nothing better to do than to trick him, right? After pondering for several nights, he finally chose to open the window and speak frankly. Even if it's the more, the better, at least there should be a limit, right? Brother Diding, can't you at least give me a number? As a result, Diding held his teacup and thought for a long time, and then nodded and said, "That's right." Then, he directly transferred the deposit sufficient to cover Huai Shi's cerebral hemorrhage to the Ivory Tower's public account. "Let's try 100,000 guns first," Diding responded. "We'll talk about it later if it's useful." Chapter 1097. Until now, more than 90% of the Foundry Center's production had been taken up by the Dongsha genealogy. Until today, only 8,600 pieces had been delivered. But the next day, after the first batch arrived, Diding ordered another 100,000 pieces, until Huai Shi couldn't help but call Yi Shuiya. Yi Shuiya only asked him 2 questions. Who is the most important person in the Dongsha genealogy? Once someone leaves, the Dongsha genealogy will immediately have problems. I don't need to explain it in detail. You can make a list yourself. The first was naturally the master of the genealogy, Mystic Bird. Next up was the strongest archaeologist, his natural enemy, Chu Hai. But what about next? White Emperor's son. No matter how good White Emperor's son was there no one else in Dongsha that could fight? Qilin? Qilin was powerful, but Dongsha would still continue to rotate without him. Baizhe? In a sense, that kind of luck was indeed the best in Dongsha. However, unless Dongsha really couldn't survive, why would they rely on luck to survive? Dieting? Qiongqi? Or the primal chaos that appeared out of nowhere? Or the torch dragon that had retired for who knows how many years? None of them. The final answer was a little brother that had been ignored by everyone for 10,000 years. Perhaps I am the cloud that solidifies my body. Yan Qingge. As the rank 5 soaring serpent of Dongsha, he also held the title of the North Star. For a long time, Yan Qingge was considered the shame of the rank 5 because of his overly tanky combat strength. After all, he was someone who could deal damage and was stronger than him. But those who thought so often overlooked a problem. The essence of the Ascended was that they were tools. Since they were tools, being useful was the most important thing. Could it be that Mystic Bird, with the white wolf hook, could really make the genealogy's account become useless? Also, even if the genealogy's account became useless, why did they have to go through so much trouble to give him the North Star? The answer was that there were too many of them. To put it more crudely, there were too many of them to count. Since his debut, Yan Qingge had always used one move to conquer the world: doppelgangers. If 1 wasn't enough, 10 wasn't enough. If 10 wasn't enough, then 100. If 100 wasn't enough, then 10,000. According to the observations and records of the outside world, Yan Qingge could have as many as 100,000 clones at the most exaggerated time. In fact, this was far from his limit. Dong Xia hadn't used the correction value yet, and it would only increase if she used it. 100,000 doppelgangers meant 100,000 copies of Yan Qingge's. As long as there was one left, it wouldn't count as all of them dying. Of these 100,000 doppelgangers, even the weakest, most incompetent, and most useless one was still a sublimator. According to the Statistics Department of the Directorate of Command, there were over 1.4 million ascendants in the world. He alone could forcefully expand it by another 100,000. If 100,000 people were used to open up hell, they would be 100,000 pioneers. If they were used to maintain order, they would be 100,000 policemen. If they were used in war, an army of 100,000 sublimators that possessed souls and origin substances, shared one heart, shared thoughts, and could instantly change strategies and receive information. Furthermore, unless the last person in the command center died, they would not collapse. It was an absolute nightmare. And this was only his lower limit. As for his upper limit, there was no upper limit. There was only a limit to how much he could spend. It all depended on how much equipment he could get. There was no point in giving him a full set of equipment. More importantly, how was he going to arm 100,000 people? Even Xian Niao would go bald if there was a shortage of 100,000 people. Even if Dong Xia was a large organization, it couldn't completely revolve around a single person, right? Weren't they going to continue living? And at this time, when a good blacksmith from Dong Xia, who was extremely reliable and had a high production output, quietly passed by, he was already destined to be targeted by Xian Niao. What did it mean to have a golden wind and a jade do surpass countless human encounters? What did it mean to be a match made in heaven? That was what it meant to be. If it weren't for the fact that Huai Shi had already been deeply tied to celestial genealogy and couldn't be undone, Xian Niao would have pulled him back even if he didn't care about his reputation. Now, other than doubling the number of people sent for training, he had to get Huai Shi to sign the contract first. Although he didn't know what kind of deal Russell had with Xian Yao, the direct result was that Huai Shi's production for the next 10 or so years had basically been bought out by Dong Xia. It was hard to say what would happen 10 or so years later. There were so many orders in front of him, but because he hadn't been single for long enough and his hand speed wasn't fast enough, he couldn't make any money. This made Huai Shi's eyes red with anger, and he wondered where he could go to get a large amount of correction points. However, Jaeger's anti-hypertensive medicine wasn't for nothing. Right now, the Bureau was guarding against Russell like he was a thief, and there was no way for them to succeed. On the other hand, Huai Shi still owed them a large sum of money, and he wished he could send them a text every few days to ask for payment. This time, Ai Qing might have come with this intention. In response, Huai Shi could only say, "What does the money Russell borrowed have to do with me, Huai Shi?" There was no way he could return the money. He was so poor that he was about to die. When he had broken through, it had felt great. But after he had broken through, problems had begun to appear. Relying on the Bureau's origin substance supplies and correction points, Huai Shi could naturally summon the wind and summon the rain. He was incomparably awesome, and he could do whatever he wanted on the endless seas. Using the Nautilus to reforge the Imperial Palace was indeed the best option, but the problem was that the better the item, the more expensive it was. This was especially true for a deep-strike warship like the Nautilus. Just driving it out and burning fuel alone would cost an astronomical figure. Ordinary origin substance crystals weren't enough. There were too many impurities, which would cause abnormalities in the Nemo engine when it exceeded the speed limit. If he wanted to overclock it, he would have to burn an even higher layer of liquefied essence. The world's largest source of liquefied essence was the Silver Sea. It didn't even need to be processed. He could just casually grab a spoonful. The problem was that every spoonful of liquefied essence was a spoonful less of humanity's lifeblood. Even if Jaeger was crazy, there was no way he would agree. He would have to process it himself. The processing ratio of ordinary origin substance crystals to liquefied essence was 29:44:1. This was just the cost of fuel. It didn't include maintenance, equipment, or even weapons replenishment. The figures for every project were enough to make Huai Shi's liver tremble. Even worse, Huai Shi didn't even have any mana. Cloud Lord was most famous for having a lot of mana. Every time he advanced, his origin substance reserves would at least triple, and the Krypton version would have 5 times or more. But the problem was that Cloud Lord also used up a lot of mana. Didn't thunder and rain cost money? Even though Huai Shi's origin substance reserves had increased by more than 8 times after he advanced, it was still useless. After returning to the Ivory Tower and completing the preparations for the Nautilus, he had only used his full strength once in order to cooperate with the data collection. It took 10 seconds for the Iron Rain and Thunder Light to flatten the fortifications that had been created using the White City stronghold as a template. Not even a fragment larger than a fist could be found. And 10 seconds later, Huai Shi was gone. He had overdrawn his origin substance and was paralyzed for half a day. The cost and expenditure caused the vice principal's hair to wither at a rate of 20%. In the end, everyone came to a conclusion. Huai Shi was very awesome, Huai Shi was very powerful, but at the same time, Huai Shi was also very expensive. After Russell saw the results, he immediately gave an order. Stay here and don't move. Wait for Orange and the Sucker to grow out on their own. Otherwise, everyone would have thrown this scourge into the battlefield of the War of the Realms long ago to stir up trouble. How could they let him stay at home and waste his time away? Russell absolutely couldn't agree to this before the Federal Bureau of Investigation was willing to pay the bill. Otherwise, the little money he had saved up with great difficulty would probably be burned up by a few random shots from his students every day. He might even owe a huge debt, and the great Loki would be reduced to a state where he couldn't protect his integrity in his old age. Huaishur also didn't expect that one day, as a tool, he would actually be forced to retire to the second line because of the cost-performance ratio. Every day, all he did was read the newspaper and take a walk. He was so bored that he was about to die. Don't tell me I have to do all the exciting work? On this boring afternoon, Huaishur slumped in his chair and groaned helplessly. Then, he heard a knock on the door without any warning. 5 hours ago, Yomi no Kuni dojo. 10 minutes before the unconnected call was broadcasted, he saw a black car in front of the door without any identification, license plate, logo, or even similar model. Years of family education, influence, and his own outstanding ability to commit crimes, all of these intuitions brought about a faint sense of foreboding in his heart the moment he saw the car. Especially after he asked the gatekeeper didn't know the origin of the car. They only knew that the person accompanying it had a terrifying background. He first wrote 2 preset text messages, pressed the phone number to Huaishur's number, and walked in. Then, he smelled the smell of disinfectant. It was in the air. It was so thin, but it was distinct, evoking his family education when he was 6 years old. On that day, after he finished watching the rerun of Supernatural Eagle on TV, his grandfather picked him up from the ground and carried him to his study room. He opened the door of the darkroom and pointed at the things on the shelf, making him remember them one by one. The things, patterns, logos, and characteristics of the first to third rows represented fat sheep that must not be let go. Collect as many as you can. If you can't collect them all, call the whole family to collect them together. Everyone will definitely give you a big share. The 4th to 6th rows were things that the forest hut had to turn around and run as far and as fast as possible after seeing them. It included and was not limited to the logo of the Dark Army, the emblem of the destruction element, the symbol of the fallen country, the Sea of Thunder, and even the symbol of the Eternal World Group, and the things in the last row were very simple. After encountering them, don't run. Eat, drink, and play. Seize the time to have some fun. If the situation was not good, immediately slit your throat. That way you can leave more easily. Most importantly, don't King bring these things into the house. Among them, the smell was different from all the other disinfectants. It was clean and pure to the point that even the most sophisticated sterile room could not compare to it. There was only one place it represented, and only the people there would have such a strange smell lingering on them. Continuation Academy. Chapter 1098. At the end of the recollection, the footsteps of the cabin in the woods did not stop. Just like a stroll, he casually moved forward, walked half a circle without a trace, turned around nimbly and smoothly, and walked in the direction of the gate. Without changing his face, he smiled and waved to everyone he knew. Then, the hand in the trouser pocket quietly broke the copper plate to ask for help from Huaishur. Finally, he dialed his mobile phone. After waiting for the sound to pass once, it became a busy tone. All signals sent to the outside world were coldly and carefully blocked. His smile was stiff for a moment. Look up. On the road outside the gate, a strange figure covered in a protective suit appeared. His face was hidden behind a gas mask, and behind the lens, there was only darkness. Nothing could be seen. His whole body was surrounded by an ominous aura that made the small house in the forest feel creepy. At this moment, the strange newcomer was standing in the crowd, but other than him, no one else paid any attention to him. The dull electronic voice had no ups and downs. "Nice to meet you, Mr. Lin," he said calmly. "You can call me 008. In order to avoid misunderstanding, please don't do unnecessary things. Things here have nothing to do with you. I'm sorry to disturb you." The cabin in the woods smiled awkwardly, as if he had accidentally walked into the wrong toilet, and waved his hand. I'll go, considering that your 6 personality simulations have made things develop beyond the plan, please allow me to use the 6-level adjustment plan," in short, 008 said stiffly. please sleep first. At that moment, in his hand, there was a stick as thick as a pencil, and he pointed it at the face of the cabin in the woods. The young man's face remained unchanged, and he disappeared in an instant. Then, he appeared in front of 008. The curse in the shadow protruded from his fingertips, condensed into a slender blade, aimed at his face and cut down. Idiot! Inside the ring on his finger, he roared, "You're not qualified to keep your measly tricks!" Snap! His voice disappeared in an instant. And in the front end of the stick in 008's hand, it released a light like a flashlight, which disappeared in a flash. However, under the cover of the light, the small house in the woods felt that the many evil beasts that it kept in its shadow, the cursed armor that wrapped around its soul, and even the medium that was hidden all over its body had all disappeared without a trace. Even the divine mark itself. In a short moment, he was beaten back to his original form, becoming a youth that could be seen everywhere. Then, he froze in midair, unable to move. Cough, cough about that, he blinked innocently. It's a misunderstanding, brother. It's all a misunderstanding. Pa. The light flashed again, and his eyes gradually dimmed and lost their luster. Memory cleared, thinking reorganization, hibernation setting, gravity grab. Under the wave of that slender pencil stick, an invisible force pulled the small house in the forest, brought him into the training hall, and finally sent him to the bed. Snoring sounds could be heard. 5 hours later, a messenger from the dojo knocked on Huai Shi's door respectfully. Mr. Huai Shi. The messenger bowed respectfully and presented the name card and visiting card from the Sword Saint with both hands. Teacher, please see me. Huai Shi got up from the chair. Recently, the Sword Saint Shangchuan had been living in seclusion. In addition to gradually handing over the dojo and other powers, his physical condition was deteriorating day by day. According to the small house in the woods, he was about to die. The High Emperor also claimed to be sick and refused to see him. Why did he come here all of a sudden? But no matter what, etiquette could not be neglected. With Mr. Shangchuan's identity and condition, why did you lower yourself to come here? Huai Shi took the name card and nodded in response. As a junior, there's no need for an elder to come here personally. Since I'm free today, why don't you take me to the dojo to visit? But the messenger's words stunned him for a long time. Thank you for your concern, Mr. Huai Shi. Teacher has arrived and is downstairs. When Huai Shi lifted the blinds and looked out of the window, he saw the car parked in front of the building. There were no signs, emblems, or even license plates. No one came out of the car. Through the window, the scene behind was blurry. Even with his eyesight and perception, he could not perceive anything. What's more, this feeling, Huai Shi's heart sank. The Continuation Academy? He asked. I don't know about other things, and it's not something I should inquire about or know. The messenger bowed and asked earnestly, Mr. Huai Shi, please come with me for a chat. He's already downstairs. How can I not see him? Huai Shi shook his head and pushed the door open. He was not worried about the Sword Saint's intentions. Although the Continuation Academy had a terrible reputation, he had been in and out many times without seeing them do anything to him. Instead, he was more confused about how Sword Saint Shangchuan got involved with them. As a result, as soon as he went downstairs, he saw a decrepit old man with an oxygen mask on his face behind the open backseat door. Amidst her heavy breathing, Kamikaze raised her eyes and blinked at Huai Shi as a greeting. Huai Shi also nodded and saluted. Then, he looked beside him. Other than the strange person with a strange gas mask on his face in the front passenger seat, the driver was actually the officer of the Ingzhou Palace inner hall. Just as Huai Shi was puzzled, he saw Shangchuan raise his finger with difficulty, as if he was beckoning him to come closer. A muddy and low voice sounded from behind the mask. Don't look, kid, don't worry, the Sword Saint's chest rose and fell violently as he panted. Do me a favor, Kill who? Huai subconsciously looked at the officer of the inner hall in the driver's seat, which made the middle-aged man's expression twitch, and his neck felt cold. But looking at this guy's meaty appearance, he didn't seem to be difficult. It couldn't be the guy from the looming hall, right? That would be a little troublesome. He had just killed him once some time ago, so it wasn't easy to do it. Ha, Shangchuan was amused. I'm a dignified sword saint. Do I still need to find you to kill someone? At the end of his sentence, he began to cough violently and stopped talking. He patted the escort beside him. The escort nodded and took out a slender iron box from the trunk. He held it with both hands. After opening it, the silent long blade was revealed. An ancient glow appeared on the long blade that had been dismantled. After a long time, the blade was still as bright as new. A ferocious phantom faintly appeared on the smooth blade. Killing intent. Peerless. With just a glance, Huai could feel the sharpness that had been brewing for a long time and the ferocity that was entrusted to it, as if it was choosing a person to devour. Even among the many relics at the border, it was definitely a treasure that was ranked at the top. It was not even inferior to his own origin substance equipment. Unfortunately, the origin substance in it had decayed, as if it had suffered a heavy blow. It had been sealed for too many years and no one had used it. It was on the verge of death. After seeing the blade inscription on the blade of Mitsuyo Mike, the corner of Huai eyes could not help but twitch. Grand Ceremony Tai Mitsuyo. This was one of Ingzhou's 5 swords of the world. Repair it, Shang Quan asked. Can you do it? To be honest, it's a little difficult. Huai was silent for a moment and said straightforwardly, although the activation of Nirvana Rebirth is very convenient, I'm afraid it's not easy to find materials that can match it. The materials are provided by the Continuation Institute. The masked man in the passenger seat said in a monotonous electronic voice, You just need to ask. Then I'll give it a try. Huai replied, but it might not be able to guarantee success. He closed the box and took one last look at the visitors. Please follow me. 15 minutes later, the foundry center was completely empty. Under the huge foundry, the pale alchemy fire had been reignited. Huai lowered his head to look at the long blade in the box. He reached out and reassembled all the parts. The weathered blade let out a soft cry in his hand. It was as if it was resisting his control and unwilling to be driven by others. But in the end, it didn't have the strength to support it. Soon, it returned to silence. Huai also breathed a sigh of relief after a detailed inspection. It's just that the lack of source substance caused the internal miracle to collapse. He looked at the blade and felt the echo in the steel. The alchemy array and structure are not damaged at all. No, it should have been maintained, right? The craftsmanship is quite meticulous. There's no difference between it and the original part. This was to be expected. No matter how poor it was still a precious weapon of the royal family. Ingzhou's famous 5 swords of the world was an important relic that was inseparable from the country's history and past. Because of this, Huai wondered why they were looking for him because of this. It wasn't that Ingzhou couldn't afford to hire a grandmaster. It was just a matter of how much it would cost. Moreover, the Continuation Institute was here. For this kind of basic maintenance, it wasn't worthwhile to find an outsider like him. But since there was a sucker coming to give him money, could he back out the door and not take it? Huai didn't hesitate to make a list of materials that were more than 5 times the actual amount. It was up to the Continuation Institute to see if they were willing to pay. In the end, when the masked man opened the box next to him, the materials on Huai list were all there. There were even 3 times more. There was definitely something wrong with these people's brains. But they gave him money when he wanted, and they gave him things when he wanted, and they brought their own materials. They even asked Xiao Huai to make some boiled noodles. He was just a business, so why should he care so much? He just had to do it. Very quickly, under Huai protection, the ancient sword, which had originally been devoid of origin substance, once again had a tangible fierceness. A sharp and cold aura soared into the sky. The ancient sword emitted a high-pitched howl. Just by swinging it casually, the sharp aura caused cracks to appear on the walls and floor. Fortunately, I didn't disappoint you. Huaisher turned the long blade around and handed it over. Or do you want to take a closer look at the effects? The masked man didn't take the item. He just nodded slightly. That's exactly what I'm here for. Alright, I knew you guys would like to see this. Huaisher sighed and pushed open the door to the side. He walked into the innermost layer of the foundry center, an area formed by layers of thick walls and cages. Sensing the waves of malice coming from the relic in his hand, he sighed and raised it high again. Foundry, begin. In that instant, the steel in Huaisher's right hand unfolded. The foundry formed by the Nemo engine rumbled, and a large amount of origin substance poured into it, covering every inch of the steel from the inside out, bestowing miracles, forging, rebirth, and even activation. A terrifying gravitational force appeared on the blade. The greedy Taotai sucked away 1/3 of Huaisher's origin substance in an instant. Then, after being given enough power, the grand ceremony Tai Guangshi in his hand erupted with power and flew out of his hand. In an instant it was nailed into the center of the ground. Then, the sharp sound of steel rubbing against each other could be heard. The narrow blade suddenly began to expand, and a huge arm several meters long suddenly stretched out from it, grabbing the ground and leaving 4 deep ravines. Then, a second arm, an incomparably huge body, and even a head in the end, amidst the proliferation of countless iron lights, an ear-piercing roar suddenly burst forth. The last shackles were violently torn apart. A huge shadow slowly rose, and a pair of amber vertical pupils drooped down, coldly looking at the overconfident maintainer in front of him. It was like an ape or a baboon, but it was wearing armor and feet that only generals had. Its slender face was painted with bright oil, and the hair all over its body stood up like copper needles. When they collided with each other, sparks flew from the friction. The steel ape, which was more than 10 meters tall and wore a sunwheel crown on its head, propped up its body and wantonly vented its violent ferocity. Then, it raised its hand and violently smashed Huaisher, who was close at hand. Huaisher was expressionless. Just as he was about to make a move, he heard footsteps coming from behind him. A withered hand stretched out from behind him, lifted up, and opened its slightly trembling 5 fingers, taking this earth-shattering blow head-on. It stood still. When Huaisher turned around in shock, he saw the withered figure behind him. His face was covered with wrinkles and age spots, drooling, white hair in a mess, and there was still a socket for an indwelling needle on his arm. Sword Saint Shangchuan. Very good. Huaisher. You did very good. The Sword Saint, who was clearly on the verge of death, stepped forward. After passing him, he finally said, "For the next matter, you just need to stand aside." As he spoke, he stretched out his hand. Behind him, an attendant rushed over, knelt on the ground, and offered an ordinary katana with both hands. The moment the katana fell into the withered hand, it burst forth with a sound that was not inferior to the 5 swords of the world. "Hey, I haven't seen you for so many years." Under the shroud of white hair, the old face grinned and laughed amidst the fine choking coughs. This guy haven't been, well?" The great ape looked down. Looking down at the pale human in front of him, he frowned, but soon seemed to remember something and gradually came to a realization. He actually spoke in a human voice. "It's you again, Shangchuan. You're already so old, yet you still don't want to be lonely?" "Yes." The Sword Saint nodded, drooling like silk, "Just like you. If that's the case, then die like a swordsman." The great ape said, "I'll help you. Thank you." The Sword Saint laughed, however. "You're still far." At that moment, the old man swung his sword. It was clearly deep underground, separated by countless obstacles, but at this moment, the people present clearly heard the whistling sound from the sky above, like a hurricane sweeping past. Then, the blade flashed and disappeared, and the sound spread, like a magnificent bell from a palace. It was deafening. The great ape staggered a step back, and a deep crack appeared on its armor and body. "This move is called Sword of Sky City," Shangchuan asked without turning his head. "Did you see it clearly?" Huaishe nodded. "How much have you learned?" Shangchuan asked again. Huaishe thought for a moment and shrugged helplessly. "I can only say that I've learned a little." "Heh, a guy with no comprehension." The sword saint shook his head, as if he had given up the idea of teaching on the spot. His two hands held the hilt of the sword tightly, and he raised it high, aiming at the opponent in front of him. The famous sword of the world after being activated, the crystallization of slaughter left behind by countless swordsmen in the history of Yingzhou. It was like looking down on him. "Roar, come!" Tai Guangshi grinned. The great iron ape did not care about the new wounds on its body. When it raised its hands that resembled a human's, endless water blades of nothingness were aimed at Shangchuan's face from afar. They were in a stalemate. In the dead silence, only the air let out waves of mournful wails. When the nothingness wills collided with each other in this narrow cage, everything was frozen by the bone-piercing killing intent. Huaishe could not help but take a step back. He could feel what was brewing in that old body, the weakened origin substance, the soul on the verge of collapse, the dying body, and even the disordered breathing, the difficult heartbeat. None of this could stop the power sleeping in the darkness from truly awakening. That thing called will. The nothingness's will, at this moment, reversed reality, shook all souls, and intimidated all enemies. It was like a scorching sun rising from the old man's body, blooming with endless power. At this moment, when the blade of the sword slashed down, it shot out a dazzling evil intent and killing intent that made the soul tremble. It created death. After an instant of collision, Shangchuan sheathed his sword. Behind him, the shadow of the great ape silently dispersed. Only two broken pieces of the long sword were left on the ground, and countless cracks broke into pieces. They turned into dust. There was no room for repair. The old man who returned to the wheelchair put on the oxygen mask again. The medicine from the Preservation Institute flowed into his body bit by bit, maintaining this body that was riddled with holes from collapsing in a short period of time. And Shangchuan spoke again. Next, the follower stepped forward again and presented the iron box to Huaishe. Under the entanglement of layers of Buddha beads, the sharp blade in the box still emitted bursts of evil and strange aura. The bloody light flowed and cried out hungrily. Blade inscription, eternity. It was also one of the 5 swords in the world, Juzumaru eternity. After a short silence, Huaishe could not help but turn around and ask, "Let me guess, are there 3 more?" It was just as he had said. At the feet of the Preservation Institute's strange person, 3 overlapping iron boxes quietly appeared. "Please continue, Mr. Huaishe," he said. "The data collection has just begun." Chapter 1099. Since the Continuation Academy asked him to continue, then he would continue. Huaishe unceremoniously took a tube of source essence from the box and poured it into his mouth. After replenishing a portion of his mana bar, he stuffed the rest of the items into his pocket. Since the wool was delivered to his door, he would harvest it. The visitor from the Continuation Academy was indifferent, as if he didn't see it at all and didn't care at all. He was just waiting for the next data and result. Casting restart. This time, in Huaishe's hand, Juzumaru disappeared without a trace after a whisper, as if it had evaporated without warning. But at that moment, Huaishe felt her hair stand on end. She heard soft footsteps behind her, but there was nothing there. Everyone present felt a chill rising in their hearts. Next to the sword master's wheelchair, the attendant who accompanied him had already stiffened in place. He felt a chill close at hand, and his whole body was frozen. Just behind the white-haired old man, in the dim shadow, a faint outline emerged. It looked like a monk wearing a bamboo hat, draped in a dark red robe, with layers of prayer beads wrapped around his wrist and neck, but his face was hidden in the shadow under the bamboo hat. Only a faint bloody light outlined the position of his eyes. He was lowering his head, overlooking the old man's back. Kamikaze didn't respond, and even his turbid eyes didn't waver. "What's wrong, fake monk?" he asked hoarsely. "Are you thinking of enlightening me?" "It's too late." The monk shook his head indifferently. "Benefactor's obsession is blazing, your 6 roots are dirty, and your sins are deep. You have already fallen into the realm of Avicii calling. Dharma is already at its wit's end. Then what are you waiting for?" Kamikaze sneered, tapping the scabbard in front of his knees. He deliberately stretched his neck and exposed his dry and slender neck. "I have long heard that Juzumaru is a sword that kills souls and slays evil," he said. "Please try to slay an evil spirit like me. That's how it should be." The blood-stained monk raised his hand and took off his bamboo hat. From his face, shrouded in bloody fire, a fanaticism of joy emerged. He murmured hoarsely, "Avatara Samyak Sambodhi." At that moment, the blood-red and evil aura faded away. A pure blade appeared from the scabbard and slashed towards the sword saint's neck. The illusory light flashed and disappeared. His speed had already surpassed that of lightning and was comparable to the circulation of thoughts and thoughts. No, it was even faster than that. This was because what was chopped down was not an actual substance, but a blade of bubbles created by the essence of awareness and compassion. Wherever the blade passed, all evil karma, all filth, all impurities, and all delusions were destroyed. A deathly silence descended. In the long silence, Shang Quan remained silent. She closed her eyes slightly and sighed silently. A cracking sound could be heard behind him. The sword-wielding monk froze on the spot. Blood flowed out and the flames were extinguished. Cracks appeared on the blurry face as he staggered back a step. He was clearly not the one who was beheaded. But it was hard to suppress this cry of fear. The bubble burst, and the sword of destroying evil and revealing righteousness collapsed silently. Resolution and compassion could not cut away the opponent's arrogance and obsession, but were instead destroyed by the steel-like mastery in the soul. Righteousness. Shang Quan shook his head. That's all there is to it. Behind him, the monk in the shadow silently dissipated, leaving behind a long, rusty knife that no longer shone. After losing the essence of guardian and compassion, it fell to the mortal world. There was no possibility of recovery. Next. Shang Quan looked down sleepily. "At least give me something. That won't make me yawn." Huaishur turned around and looked at the open box behind him. The 3 dust-covered sharp blades clanged in the sword saint's whispers. Evil, ferocious, solemn. All kinds of auras spread like flames. He closed his eyes and casually took one out. Then, he raised his eyebrows. "Tongji Yasunoki?" Huaishur sighed softly. "This should be able to cheer up the old pretentious senior, right?" 5 minutes later, the expressionless Shang Quan returned to the wheelchair. Next. Damn it, he was pretentious again. Then, it was the next one, and the one after that from the ruthless and fierce giant steel ape, Odin Taigwa, who wanted to hold everything in the world in his hands, to the soft and strange sword of guardian, Juzumaru, who devoured all evil, to the evil sword, Tongji Yasunoki, who sealed the former wine into the blade and turned disaster into power, to the sword of the king, Mikazuki Munakika, who held hegemony and broke mountains. And finally, the sword of pure slaughter, Anamaru Kakazuna, who killed all evil and endless evil in less than an hour. The 5 swords of the world were all destroyed in front of the sword saint. What he used was only the unparalleled swordsmanship that could frighten ghosts and frighten gods, which was an eye-opener for Huaishur. The sword of the heavenly city that could reach the heavens with a single thought, the sword of the heavenly city that was unparalleled and domineering, the saber of the sun that could shatter a city, the ever-changing illusion of the real and the illusory, the endless split-light bubbles, the battle of life and death, the collapsing momentum with just a casual swing. Huai Shi saw a lofty world that he had never imagined. After struggling at death's door for so many years, the old body still contained the ambition to cut down the sun and the moon, and the skills that Huai Shi could not reach. It had nothing to do with Elder Luo always saying that Huai Shi lacked comprehension, and compared with the real strong, the talents he possessed were still far behind. But who would want to compete with others in this? If someone wanted to beat him, unless someone jumped out and played a cello song that no one had ever played before or since, even Huai Shi would refuse to flatter him. But was there really such a person in this world? Well, maybe there was such an old monster hidden in the headquarters of the Music Association of All Hells? But even if there was, the cello was such an unpopular instrument, no one would have such attainments as Huai Shi, right? It could only be said that being invincible was so lonely. With the thought of sacred swordsman, not bad. Huai Shi applauded along with the crowd. As for Shangchuan, who was standing on the field and stepping on the gradually dissipating wraith's corpse, she was moved by the cheers and applause. She only turned around and looked at the guest from the Continuation Academy, who stood beside her without saying a word. "How is it?" the stooped old man asked in a hoarse voice. "Is this old man's sword acceptable?" "It's enough." The mysterious man who called himself 008 nodded, and his electronic voice was flat. "It's 30% better than expected. It seems that aging didn't make you weaker, and after so many years of entanglement with death, you've become stronger." "Stronger? How am I strong?" Shang Quan sneered and shook his head. "Can I be considered strong just by winning a few rounds against that kind of dead thing? It's too ridiculous. The so-called swordsmanship is, in essence, a way to kill people. Only a living person can show its essence." As he spoke, his pair of muddy old eyes looked at Huai Shi, who was watching the fun and eating, making Huai Shi's expression stiffen. "After watching the monkey show for so long, you have to leave something behind, right, Huai Shi?" Shang Quan coughed and smiled faintly. "That indifferent look, you don't put me in your eyes at all. Wait." Huai Shi subconsciously raised his hand and said solemnly, "I have a good disciple, surnamed Lin and named Zhonghua. He's very talented and his strength is the best among his peers. Why don't we let him play a few rounds with sacred swordsmen?" "No." Shang Quan shook his head. "I'm still waiting for that kid to marry into the family so that I can manage the dojo in the future. If he's scared, wouldn't that girl Yao Xiang be sad? Then why don't you go find Qilin, find the old man of the Yuan family, or find Luo Siwei in hell?" Huai Shi glanced at him from the corner of his eyes. Until now, how could he not figure out what kind of dogskin plaster this old man was selling in his gourd? "Sacred swordsman, it's fine that you're doing rehabilitation exercises, but can't you find something more difficult? Why use me, a junior, as a stepping stone?" "It's because I won't lose that I specifically looked for you, Huai Shi," Shang Quan replied frankly. "I can't be too strong, or I'll strain my muscles and bones. I can't be too weak, or I won't be able to perform at all. It just so happens that I have you, neither strong nor weak, within the range of this old man." He thought for a moment and said seriously, "This is the art of war." "Well, your Yingzhou's art of war is only about teaching people how to eat and beating the cooks, right?" Seeing that the old man stopped coughing when he thought of beating the weak, Huai Shi felt that he might not be able to escape today. He sighed. "Have you thought it through?" "Haha, don't worry." Shang Quan grinned. "I'll be merciful." "No, I just want to remind you." Huai Shi slowly got up from the chair, patted the non-existent dust on his knees and buttocks, and moved his body. "Apart from being smelly and hard as a stepping stone, I'm also a bit slippery. Be careful, old man, if you don't step firmly, you might sprain your ankle." Shang Quan was slightly stunned, and then he couldn't help but shake his head and sigh. "I like the way you boast shamelessly, Huai Shi. You seem to always be full of vitality, hope, and the future." He sighed sincerely. "Every time I meet a junior like you, it makes me feel happy from the bottom of my heart." "Is that so?" Huaisher walked into the field indifferently, closed the door behind him, and answered perfunctorily, "That's too happy." "That's right." The old man paused for a moment, grinned, and revealed a cruel smile that was exactly the same as Luo Siwei's. "Especially, every time I think about what kind of frustration and despair those hopeful faces will show in a while, it makes me so excited that I can't control myself. When I think about how some people will not dare to hold a sword for the rest of their lives under my attack, and will tremble in nightmares for the rest of their lives, it makes me so excited that my stomach rumbles, and I can't be full when a calf is born. It really sees the ferocity of a tiger, when a boastful guy really understands the majesty of a mountain, when he sees the tragic corpses of countless fellow travelers who died with their eyes open, when he luckily escapes from the blade of a sword and spends the rest of his life eternally in the shadow. This fear that is engraved in the hearts of the weak is the only way to prove strength." The words he said were obviously so ugly and ferocious, but the old man's expression was so solemn, the so-called swordsmanship, the so-called fighting, the so-called skills. After removing all the high-sounding excuses, all the ways of fighting in the world exist for this reason. In the silence, Huaisher couldn't help but shake his head. "To be honest, I'm not interested in your reasons. However, at this point, even if I say that I'm actually a musician, you certainly won't let me go, right? So, I only have one question." He paused for a moment, looked outside, and asked seriously, "Do you reimburse me?" 008 nodded without hesitation. 10 times, he said. At that moment, Huaisher narrowed his eyes with a smile, and no longer had any scruples. In this way, he took the first step toward the Sword Saint, toward the peak that no martial artist in the present state could surpass. "So, barehanded?" The Sword Saint sneered. "Where's your Tian-Ke, Huaisher? Why don't you take out your nautilus and show it to people? Isn't it already in front of you, Your Excellency Sword Saint?" At that moment, Huaisher raised his hand and snapped his fingers. The whole steel building roared, and layers of heavy structures quickly turned over. Huge equipment rose and fell, and countless cables extended rapidly. When huge modules collided with each other, blazing sparks burst out. With the crisp snap of the fingers, the whole world seemed to be resonating in a low voice. As far as the eye could see, the steel sky and earth, the whole structure buried deep in the ground, and even the casting center protruding from the ground were just an extension of the Nautilus. Here, it has long been covered by the Tian-Ke. Now, the huge main gun suddenly protruded from the ceiling above Huaisher's head, aiming at the unsuspecting old man in front of him. With the roar of the tide that Nemo's engine had already run to the limit. Brazenly firing. Chapter 1100. After the maintenance and repair of the ivory tower, the main cannon of the Nautilus, cross-depth strike mass weapon, a whaling harpoon, was also brand new. Although due to the limitations of funds and materials, it was temporarily impossible to create a special cannonball that could severely injure and shackle some small rulers. Grand Master Mikhail still left the Sky Fortress, which was about to be finished, in his busy schedule, and specially made a total of 48 heavy mass annihilation cursed bullets for it. Of course, the war tool that could vaporize half of the ivory tower in one shot was absolutely impossible to use on the Sword Saint. Otherwise, if he was not careful, the old senior would be gone, and Huaisher himself would probably be finished. He did not even use the hellish annihilation missiles that were used to wipe out the ground. He just purely extracted the origin substance, and in a very short distance, in this short moment, carried out a combined attack. Under the push of the Nemo engine, dozens of origin substance armaments cracked in the furnace. A sea of disasters and miracles collided with each other, completely stimulating the qualitative change of light and shadow, gathering into a turbulent light and shooting. A large amount of metal vapor condensed into iron sand that shone like stardust, mixed in, and formed a storm that could penetrate all defenses. At this moment, the mighty light rushed over, illuminating the thin figure. Shangchuan raised his hand and casually slashed down. The sound of the tide stopped abruptly, as if it was also killed by the solemn will surging on the blade. The stream of light opened up under the blade and flew out to both sides, burning a large piece of heat-resistant armor. Viscous iron flowed down, sizzling. It's like a cool breeze, very comfortable. Shangchuan held the blade, his thin neck supporting his head, and laughed strangely. Why sure, Kuan, are you such a gentle person? That's great, I like opponents who are reasonable like you the most. Reasonable? Why sure was expressionless. How was this him being reasonable? It was clearly that old thing opposite him who was being unreasonable. That's also supreme? He asked curiously. That also needs to be supreme? Shangchuan glanced at the scorched marks on both sides, and sneered in between coughs. It's just going with the flow, breaking it open like flowing water. Do you need more advanced skills? A drop of sticky saliva fell from the corner of his mouth and landed on his collar. It carried the muddy stench unique to old people. The stains were like plum blossoms. Run, why sure. He said vaguely, I'm going over. In that instant, a premonition of death suddenly burst forth from his soul. When the skinny old man took a step forward, his aged face suddenly crossed the long distance and was very close to him. He couldn't hear the sound of air being torn apart, and he couldn't feel the tiny tremors when his feet collided with the ground. Even his messy white hair didn't flutter or change at all. It was as if space had been abruptly omitted. Huai Shi's position was also omitted, along with his permission. Without asking for his permission, an invisible force sent him to his opponent. And there, in Shangchuan's hands, the blade that had fallen to the ground flipped slightly. The blade rose upwards, aiming for Huai Shi's crotch, abdomen, chest, throat, and even his head. It was not a terrifying sword technique, but a basic sword technique that was so standard that it could even be called rigid. Against the wind. But in Shangchuan's hands, it was as if an angry star had broken free from the ground and rose towards the sky, exuding a frightening and fierce aura. The ground trembled. Huai Shi suddenly stomped on the ground. His body leaned backwards, and he flew backwards, narrowly dodging this greeting sword. Immediately after, the ground beneath his feet shattered, and an angry, burning bull rose from the ground, charging towards the sword saint. The sound of metal scraping against metal flashed past. Shangchuan expressionlessly took a step to the left, stepping on the scorching ground. The raised blade seemed to be waiting for his opponent to come to him. The origin substance incarnation was cut open from the side by the impact. A deep crack appeared in the flesh and bones that were comparable to steel. Very quickly, it dissipated into the void. Without waiting for the sword saint to react, Huai Shi waved his hand. From the cracked ceiling, countless pieces of metal rained down like a storm. Under Yun Zhongjuan's will, they chaotically flew towards Shangchuan. But before he could land on the ground, he saw a heart-chilling flash of metal flash past. Hundreds and thousands of cubes of metal ingots cracked open from the center. The cracks were as smooth as a mirror. After they escaped Huai Shi's control, they piled up on the ground. Among the countless pieces of metal, Shangchuan raised his eyes. He sighed regretfully. I told you to run. Standing in place, he raised his blade and aimed it at Huai Shi's face in the air, assuming a sudden thrust. In the next instant, the light of the blade shot forward like a shooting star. In less than the blink of an eye, it crossed a long distance and got close again. An immense pressure rose from the blade. A terrifying will that seemed to have substance completely sealed the air, not allowing any escape or dodging. Just like that, it approached Huai Shi's face inch by inch. When the metal light on the blade appeared on the reflection in Huai Shi's eyes, a biting cold lightning suddenly rose from the pitch-black darkness. Burst forth. There was a loud roar. Without any warning, a blazing lightning fell from the sky and struck Shangchuan's figure. The moment Huai-Shi clasped her hands together, the countless iron ingots that had been sliced closed under her will, forming two iron walls that closed in on the old man in front of her. Then, the lightning shattered, and the iron walls broke from the middle at the waist. Wisps of dissipating lightning dissipated. Shangchuan stepped on the broken wall, leaving a scorched mark on one of his sleeves. He lowered his head, looked at the red-hot blade in his hand, and spat out a mouthful of thick phlegm with faint traces of blood. "It's not good to spit on the ground, Senior Shangchuan." Huai-Shi sighed softly. "I heard that people from Yingzhou are the most polite. You didn't put up a sign forbidding spitting on the ground." Shang Quan replied nonchalantly. She glanced at the lightning that was suddenly flickering in and out of his body. "This is the only move that's exciting, brat. It's best if you're satisfied." Huai-Shi smiled. "Of course, if you think it's enough, I can also welcome you with open arms. This is just the end of the warm-up, Huai-Shi." Shang Quan waved his hand, and the red-hot sword broke into two. He threw it to the side without any pity. Then, he hooked his finger at Huai-Shi and said, "I heard that your goods are pretty good. But why haven't you taken the initiative to offer a gift since you've been standing here for so long?" Huai-Shi couldn't help but sigh. The old man was indeed the old man, and his style was extraordinary. It was fine that he came here to beat people up, but he even asked the victim to provide him with the tools to commit the crime. He even made it seem like it was an honor to be beaten up. "Don't worry, sir, I'm still preparing," he patiently persuaded. "I'm just worried that there are too many things, and I'm afraid that it's not easy for you to carry them." Before he finished speaking, another thunderous roar erupted from the top of the sky. Thick water vapor rose to the top of the sky against the earth. In an instant, it turned into a dark cloud. Thunder and lightning flashed, and a cold and mournful light flashed. Then, a slender blade slowly emerged from the thunder and lightning and poked out from the clouds. Then, the second, third, fourth, and fifth rays of light appeared after a few short moments. The sky was filled with iron light, and countless katanas had been aimed at the old man's skinny figure. They were entwined with wisps of lightning, showing off their sharpness. "Do as you wish." Huai-Shi smiled and spread his hands. "You can take as many as you want." At that moment, the iron rain fell to the ground and swallowed everything in an instant. But in Huai-Shi's eyes, everything seemed to be unbelievably slow. Under the gaze of full concentration, he could see the old man casually stretching out his palm toward the sky. He easily closed his fingers and clamped down on a sharp blade that was heading straight for his face. Then, he casually tossed it towards Huai-Shi. It was an easy movement, but it burst out with a loud sound that was enough to suppress the thunder in the sky. After the katana that was spinning in the air cut down countless of its kind, it swept toward Huai-Shi's head. Then, Huai-Shi grasped the handle of the katana and suspended it in the air. The blade was covered with cracks and instantly shattered into dust. However, amidst the rain of swords that filled the sky, the old man laughed loudly and took a step forward. His hands casually held a large number of weapons, and he swung them casually, slashing them and destroying all the weapons that came stabbing at him and the blades that were nailed to the ground. When the two katanas were in his hands, it seemed that the world was also spinning with his movement. The hurricane rose out of thin air and retreated in all directions. Countless sharp blades flew out and nailed to every inch of the earth. Behind the wheelchair, the attendant staggered back. In front of countless flying sharp blades, 008 was motionless. His body was like a phantom, letting countless sharp blades pass through, indifferent. As for Huai-Shi, he had been engulfed by the storm. Yes, an indescribable storm that was like a natural disaster and could not be avoided. It was right in front of him. In his perception, the old man, who seemed to be about to fall dead in the next moment, began to dissolve, collapse, and spread. He detached from the outline of a person and turned into an amorphous, indescribable, all-pervasive storm. When the two blades crisscrossed and chopped down, the storm of nothingness briefly projected a fatal gap from reality, but more often, it could not be locked and detected at all. Where was the enemy? It was everywhere. The whole world had become his enemy. Under the sprinkling of Shangchuan, even the steel created by Huaishur had turned into a blade that could devour its owner. In his hands, the pure and basic sword skills were better than all secret skills and profound knowledge. Tangzhu, against the wind, Kasaya chop, reverse Kasaya, horizontal cut, stab. It was obviously a beat that they had long been familiar with and used to, but in Shang Quan's hands, it performed a terrifying chapter that Huaishur had never expected. Around Huaishur, afterimages constantly flashed. Blades, swords, axes, halberds, chains, and iron hammers. The origin substance armament was constantly changing. The incarnation appeared and disappeared immediately. The number of more than 10 times that of the opponent was easily suppressed by Shangchuan's sword. Only the sound of steel colliding with steel constantly burst out in the air. In Shangchuan's hands, the katana constantly cracked and collapsed under the rough use. Immediately, he casually pulled out another one from the ground and slashed at Huaishur again. Ah, the music is pleasant to the ear, the dance is wonderful. Huaishur, am I visiting Yoshihara's brothel? It's all ridiculous things. The old man laughed hoarsely. Why don't I see Nautilus's bombardment? And where's your miracle engraving? What about the heavenly sword that destroyed the black tide on the endless sea? Why don't you take it out? He stepped forward, his skinny body casually closing in on her. After destroying the afterimages, he lunged forward, the sharp blade in his hand casually piercing through the air. It brushed past Huaishur's face and pierced deep into the wall. On the face covered with age spots, the eyes had already turned scarlet under the torment of anger, like an evil spirit. There should be a limit to looking down on people, little brat. Huaishur was expressionless. He raised his hand, and the sword of virtue swept across, blocking the trajectory of Shangchuan's slash. Your Excellency Sacred Swordsman has not used the sacred mark and your own supreme until now, right? Moreover, he paused for a moment. In his hand, thunder burst out again. The entire foundry center suddenly shook, and a loud noise echoed in the ivory towers. Smoke and dust rose, and was quickly sucked away by the creator's framework. But at that moment the entire foundry center's roar burst out, terrifying power, the thunder brewing in the thunderclouds, and the sound of countless sharp blades had gathered in Huaishur's hand. Unlimited superposition. Even the arm that had turned into a steel structure could not bear this jaw-dropping power. As the iron fist pushed forward, it brazenly defeated the sharp blades in Shangchuan's hands. It smashed mercilessly towards his face. Mastery, symphony. At that moment, Shangchuan finally took a step back. The ferocious smile dissipated. His skinny body slowly slid out of the erupting hurricane as if he was riding on the wind. Soon, he stood still in the midst of the swords and blades. When he looked up, he saw the figure walking out of the dust and broken iron. Surrounded by thunder and flames, Huaishur dragged the solemn longsword in his hand and moved forward expressionlessly. He glanced at the opponent in front of him. He looked down on him. We are from the orchard, Jim. Do we need to rely on a cheat to deal with an old thing? Chapter 1101. In the brief silence, the follower behind the wheelchair couldn't help but tremble. He swallowed his saliva. Arrogance. A formless flame rose from the deathly silent field. It was a flame of anger that seemed to have substance. It lingered on the withered old man's body. Just the will of the void ravaged the earth to the point of collapse, and cracks appeared on the steel. The sword saint's anger. How sad! Kamiizumi sighed. Do the young people nowadays not know how to respect the old? Huaishur shrugged slightly. I have to say you were the one who attacked first. Those things don't matter. Kamiizumi smacked his lips, and his voice was hoarse. The point is, I suddenly don't want to be merciful. Same to you. Huai Shi responded indifferently. Although he didn't want to admit it, Huai Shi's defense was broken when the old man in front of him compared his skills to Yoshihara's songstress game. But so what if his defense was broken? He was anxious. In any case, Huai Shi didn't believe that this old man could beat him to death. Moreover, he had a way to deal with this kind of old man who had a bad personality and liked to abuse weak people. Come. He provocatively hooked his finger and grinned. Let me, a junior, experience the difference between myself and the sword Saint of Ingzhou. Don't worry, I will use the back of the sword. Kamiizumi answered considerately. After a short pause, he muttered vaguely, as if he was talking to himself, but, if you are killed by the back of the sword, you can't blame anyone else, right? Huai Shi instantly stiffened. He felt a chill that seemed to have substance spit out from the old man's vague words. It spread and engulfed him like a hideous nightmare. Darkness surged out from under that old and decrepit face. Then, as the sword danced, the earth was ravaged. Deep cracks spread forward in a straight line, crossing a long distance in an instant and arriving in front of Huai Shi with death. Countless steel converged, and layers of walls rose from the ground. But then, they were quickly enveloped by the expanding cracks from the bottom to the top. It broke apart from the middle. The 16 layers of walls were easily sliced apart by the pressure of the will wrapped around the sharp blade. The sharp wind cut Huai Shi's face, bringing waves of stinging pain. A ray of light shone through the straight crack and shone on his face, allowing him to see the stooped figure stepping forward. But before he could catch his breath again, he heard another wail of steel. In Kamikaze's hand, the ordinary-looking katana whistled as he swung it horizontally. Instantly, the 16 layers of steel walls in front of him were torn apart once again. Half at the waist, the crisscrossing cracks turned into a flawless cross. Under the slash of the blade, the beauty of mathematics and destruction was displayed without restraint. Outside the crumbling iron wall, the old man's thin figure had already dashed forward like a ghost. With a single step, he crossed the moat that was enough to make the broken body feel despair. The blade of his ghost-slaying god-slaying sword was already stabbing towards Huai Shi's face. What responded to him was a piercingly cold lightning. It was as if all the light in the world had gathered here, forming a furious torrent in Huai Shi's hand. The moment it left his hand, it was like a dragon galloping above the sky, bringing with it pure destruction as it pounced towards Kamikaze. And the dazzling lightning was like flowing water before the blade of the sword. It was easily wrapped around the blade, unable to move forward. Instead, it was subdued by the will on the blade, causing it to counterattack its own creator. The sword of 7 seas burst forth with the sound of waves. Under the impetus and acceleration of the supreme, pure mass was scattered out from Huai Shi's hand. The moment the katana and the blade collided, the lightning exploded, melting countless broken iron pieces into paste, illuminating the old man's old face and the pair of eyes filled with strange darkness. Look, Huai Shi. Kamikaze's face moved forward slightly, grinning hideously. If the quality is insufficient, what's the use of having more? His withered body was actually able to suppress Huai Shi's 7 seas sword. He did not yield an inch in the face of this enormous power. Under his feet the earth collapsed, and the sharp blade in his hand was also wailing, but it had created a jaw-dropping miracle. With such ordinary quality, it was able to contend against the fusion of the dual power of Ah Fang and the sword of virtue. Under Kamikaze's will. Even if it was ordinary iron, once it was in his hands, it would be a killing tool that could compete with any divine weapon. Now, the katana that Huai Shi had created himself was actually emitting a terrifying power that even Huai Shi himself could not imagine. Let me guess, you think this is supreme? Kamikaze laughed strangely. Too rigid, Huai Shi. He waved his hand, easily pushing the sword of 7 seas to the side, and pierced it again. Under the bombardment of the hammer of pain, he casually took a step back, turned around, stepped on the hammer, and stepped forward, pressing on step by step. What is supreme, Huaishur? Why have you never thought of it? Shrill cracks spread from the wall, and under the slash of the blade from afar, Huaishur retreated pathetically. He heard the hoarse voice echoing in the wind. Supreme is drinking water, peeing, picking up a piece of beef from chopsticks. It is something that you believe you can do, something that is natural. Everything should be like this. 100 steps away, the old man calmly glanced at his sorry appearance, and sighed mockingly. It's just that some disabled people think that if they can't do it, others shouldn't be able to do it either. Would you ask why an apple falls from a branch? Would you ask why the stars move in the night sky? Would you ask why birds are born to fly? Why is the utopia so glorious? Why can the Directorate of Governance allow everything to operate as usual? Why can the Continuation Academy seal off all disasters? Would you ask how the Astronomical Society could control the entire world? Even if it was inconceivable. But it was natural. Could be done, and it was done. As for the rest, it did not matter at all. It was not something that was unattainable, nor was there any mysterious veil. It was the crystallization of the spirit of the champion, the sole essence of the seeker, the determination of the swordsman to win. At the end of the road, Supreme was born. That was all. Is splitting the earth supreme? Is breaking steel a supreme tier? Engulfed and covered by the iron rain, he slowly moved forward as if he was taking a stroll, and casually asked, "Your symphony is supreme, but is your rhythm, your resonance supreme? Could it be that this attack of yours is representative of supreme itself? Is your breath at this moment in the category of supreme? What are you secretly brewing? Is the chime behind you supreme itself?" The sword saint laughed, clenching the tachi in his hand and slashing down. Thunder roared. The dark clouds that filled the sky dissipated under the sword, leaving only the reverberating sound of the bell. The sword of Sky City appeared once again. The terrible impact sent Huaishur sliding back several meters. His arm cracked and blood flowed out. But he rushed forward again as if he did not feel any pain, the halberd in his hand swinging down again. At this moment, the reverberating sound of the dark clouds dissipating, the whine of the thunder when it was annihilated, the majestic sound of the entire casting center, and even the ripples caused by the frame of the ivory tower. And his heartbeat, the fluctuation of the source form, the power of the soul, and even the sacred mark all combined into one. From this stab that surpassed the past, an unprecedented brilliance bloomed. As a response, it was a sword that was like the brilliant sun rising from the horizon. Boundless brilliance, lofty sentiments that shrouded heaven and earth were entrusted to this sword. Towards the climax of the symphony, the sword slashed out. It was the peerless sword technique that destroyed the entire border of Lava Island in the past with one strike. Blade of the Sun. Look, that's it, Huaishur. In the spreading of the terrifying waves, the old man's white hair danced in the wind, laughing excitedly because of the breakthrough of the opponent in front of him. You used it as the trump card to win, but you never realized that it was you. Remember, I'm supreme. Clearly, he had a new understanding of his own power again. Clearly, he was one step closer. But Huaishur did not feel joy in his heart at this moment. Because of the old man in front of him. Like lava spewing out from a dormant volcano again, there seemed to be a dazzling light in his dark eyes. Now, the teaching time is over. Shang Quan took a step forward and easily defeated Huaishur's counterattack again. Next, it's time to suffer. Boom. Under the slash of the back of the sword, the flail formed by the snake and the wolf's head wailed, and was defeated and sent flying backward. The blade of resentment whistled and stabbed out again, but it was blocked by Shang Quan again. Haydn's symphony at dusk collapsed under the impact of this dissonant sound. Too straightforward, Too violent, why sure? He shook his head in disdain. Other than the way a drummer uses his strength, there's no technique to speak of. But what responded to him was the soul-stirring 4 tones of fate knocking on the door. The combination of the sword of 7 seas, the explosive hammer, the halberd, and the strange sword, rose from the ground and shattered the old man's sword without warning, breaking through Shang Quan's defense and driving straight in. For the first time, he was forced to take a step back. But then, under the block of the broken sword, it stopped in front of Shang Quan's neck. This is art, old man. You don't know how to appreciate it, do you? Huai Shi shook his head and retorted sarcastically, It's fine as long as it's useful. Don't be too calculative. The sword of 7 seas slashed down again. The sound of waves and waves gathered on the blade, and the impact of the mass pushed the old man back again, sliding a few meters away. But still, he did not hit his target. Neck. You're too stubborn about decapitation, boy. He raised his hand and touched his shriveled and slender neck. It was like a stalk of wheat that would break with the slightest bit of force. But it was this broken body that was on the verge of death that had beaten Huai Shi to the point where she was unable to retaliate. Now, he threw away the broken sword in his hand, pulled out another one from the ground, and casually waved it twice. Let me teach you a principle in place of Luosiwei. Chapter 1102. In an instant it seemed that the whole world was silent. Huai Shi's lungs were instinctively convulsing. At this moment, in front of him, there was mockery, contempt, disdain, and even malice. The shriveled old man's body emitted a premonition of death that caused Huai Shi to shudder. Decapitation? Decapitation? The old man raised the long saber in his hand carefully, as if he was protecting some rare treasure. He was gentle and careful, but it made his opponent's hair stand on end, and he couldn't help but tremble. If you want to kill the enemy, why do you have to go through so much trouble? Shangquan whispered softly, as long as you can kill the soul. In that instant, the complete tachi in his hand silently turned into powder. It twisted until it broke apart, and it was completely unrecognizable and disappeared without a trace. But what replaced it was a cold light condensed by some kind of will and soul. His eyes couldn't see, his body couldn't touch, and he couldn't feel, but Huai Shi's soul clearly saw the scene that could reverse reality and illusion. It was the blade of nothingness forged by the will of the Sword Saint. It was dozens of meters away, but it made Huai Shi's vision go black. It was like an ordinary person standing in front of a huge cannon, locked on by a power that could destroy everything. Being aimed at by such a blade, he couldn't breathe at all. Now the old man, who was holding the sword of killing souls, took a step forward and crossed the insignificant distance. The blade of nothingness in his hand swept across Huai Shi's body like a breeze. It brought with it coldness and pain as if it were solid, the horrible touch when his flesh was cut by steel, and the despair when his life was taken away. The divine mark, soul, power, everything seemed to have left Huai Shi. They were all like lambs waiting to be slaughtered. His consciousness was blank. He could only watch in despair as the sword of killing souls penetrated his body, disintegrating all his defenses, and went straight in, penetrating the layers of defense of the ultimate and the celestial palace. In the end, it stopped abruptly in front of Huai Shi's soul. However, the moment they came into contact with each other, it left behind a sense of fear and gloom that came from the peak of the way of the sword. It was a gap of despair that could be carved into one's heart for a lifetime. In the dead silence, Huai Shi froze in place. The light in his eyes gradually extinguished, and his consciousness was already blank. Victory and defeat had been decided. Right in front of him, Shangquan took one last look at him and shook her head. Disaster sword? It's just SOSO. Filled with the disappointment of not being able to use his full strength and the satisfaction of being able to abuse the weak, he sneered and turned to leave. However, after taking 2 steps, His movements came to an abrupt stop. There was a pause. As if he had discovered something inconceivable, he turned around in astonishment. Behind him, the dazed young man, the opponent who should have fainted, had completely fainted under the intimidation of the soul-slaying sword. Why sure? His drooping finger twitched and twitched again. In this momentary blankness of his consciousness and soul, the remnant stubbornness still drove his body to raise his palm. It was as if he was holding an invisible pistol. He used all his strength. He pulled a non-existent trigger. At that moment, the smile on Shangchuan's face disappeared without a trace. It was as if he had seen the bullet shot by Huaishur. He clenched the non-existent tachi and slashed it down. It was clearly a non-existent counterattack and block, but everyone present seemed to have produced the high-pitched sound of an iron blade colliding with a bullet. After that strike, Huaishur did not move again. After a long time, a faint light appeared in his empty eyes again. He woke up from a long nightmare and tried his best to breathe. When he lowered his head, he saw his raised palm. He gradually understood. Look, Senior. He smiled and sighed softly. Even if the soul is dead, there are still people who can move. He raised his head and reminded him seriously, don't let your guard down against the younger generation. Shangchuan looked at him. In a short silence, he couldn't help but laugh out loud. It was hoarse and sharp, causing his decaying lungs to cough in the laughter, shaking out an empty echo. Very good, Huaishur. You're very good. Shangchuan did not hide his admiration and surprise at all. He shook his head and praised, with just this sword in the future world, you will definitely have achievements that will not be inferior to anyone, or death that will not be inferior to anyone. Huaishur was at a loss. He looked at his hand that was holding the gun. Is this a sword? It's just a tool. What's the difference in what it's called? Shangchuan shook his head indifferently. Besides, isn't the sword that you stabbed at me your unique counterattack? Just like that, he let out a long sigh and staggered away slowly. He walked out of the collapsed and broken door and returned to his chair again. The medical staff, who had been waiting for a long time, rushed up and put an oxygen mask on the dying body again. They injected life-saving drugs and carefully and hurriedly bandaged and repaired the wound. However, they could not stop the cracks from appearing on Shangchuan's body. He had long been on the verge of his limit. After breaking through the limit, only destruction was left. Save it. It's hopeless. Behind the mask, Shangchuan said vaguely. He glanced at the feudal guys beside him and finally looked at 008. I still have half a month, no, about 13 days. I hope your arrangements can be more efficient. Enough. 008 nodded and replied. Then, do you want to come with us now? What should be arranged has been arranged. Shangchuan replied without any attachment. It's time to go. Don't waste time. 008 nodded. Behind him, the door of nothingness suddenly opened. 2 rows of figures wearing chemical protective suits and gas masks like him came out. After pushing away the obstructing medical staff, they pushed Shangchuan's wheelchair and turned to walk into the darkness behind the door. At the end, Shangchuan looked at Huaishur again. A hoarse farewell. That child Yao Xiang, please take care of her in the future. Just like that, he disappeared behind the door. The door closed, and he could no longer be seen. The parting came so abruptly and so suddenly that it caught her off guard. Huaishur was stunned for a long time. Finally, he looked at 008, who stayed in place. What are you going to do? A gamble. 008's electronic voice replied. Mr. Huaishur, you are also on the list of candidates. He looked down at the data that appeared on the screen, but did not comment on anything. He continued to explain. This time, in addition to the inspection of Mr. Shangchuan's state, we also need to confirm your state. Huaishur was amused and shook his head. I didn't promise to join the Old People's Sunset Red Club. 008 was strangely silent for a moment, and even the rigid electronic voice showed a trace of sympathy and pity. Mr. Russell signed for you. Fuck, Why sure subconsciously cursed. He should have thought of it. That old bastard had been quiet for so long. How could he let his tool be idle at home and not make any arrangements? But it's okay to sell students at ordinary times. This time, he actually sold himself to the Continuation Academy. This is F** king off the list. Of course, you still have the right to refuse. 008 put his hands aside, waiting for Why Sure to figure out the cause and effect. After calming down again, he continued unhurriedly, "But before that, I hope you can listen to me and finish the matter." Why Sure took a deep breath, restrained his impulse to smoke, turned the lighter in his hand, which had run out of oil several times, and pinched it in the palm of his hand. "I'm all ears," he said. "You will participate in a struggle. You may face an unsolvable dead end. As a tool, as a chess piece, you may be required to give up your life in the end." 008 told the truth. "I don't deny the danger. After all, this action is also a big gamble for the Continuation Academy. But the greater the risk, the greater the gain, isn't it?" Why Sure was unmoved. "Danger, death, sacrifice. I have been a veteran tool and chess piece for so long that I have long been used to it. But what's the price, Mr. 008? He looked at 008 and asked solemnly, "You don't seem to have ever said what I can get. Of course, you won't return empty-handed, Mr. Why Sure." Like a machine, without any negotiation skills, 008 straightforwardly opened the price. "Apart from what Mr. Russell has got, if you can return successfully, in addition to the upgrade and transformation of the Nemo engine, the liquefaction essence needed by the Nautilus will be provided by the Continuation Academy." After a pause, he added, "What we provide is not the most basic liquefaction essence, but the pure soul after the 6th layer of qualitative change." Why Sure froze in place. "Well, the original astronomical figure is now 10 times higher. 10 times the astronomical figure is still an astronomical figure. It just makes him a little unbelievable." "Such a big number? Are you sure?" he asked. "It's just the energy that can be obtained by extracting the soul. There's no difference between sublimation and solidification." 008 replied, "We have enough bases in hell to specialize in the production of this energy to supply the consumption of the Continuation Academy itself. In fact, all of the Origin Substance supplements made from Origin Substance, including the ones distributed by the Bureau of Governance, are all provided by us. If the significance of the Directorate is to connect and control everything, then the special attributes of the Continuation Academy are destined to be independent and closed. Even if it is in the present realm, it is still independent of the present realm. Finances, output, demand. In all aspects, it is self-sufficient and does not rely on the support of the Directorate. Even if the whole present realm is destroyed tomorrow, the Continuation Academy can still persist to the theoretical period set when it was originally designed." Why Sure did not doubt 008's words. In fact, he was already tempted. Do you want to get involved? After all, the upgrade and transformation of the Nemo engine are also good. Next, the price offered by 008 made him hesitate no more. "In addition, we will provide you with a clue," 008 said, "about the dead sun." Chapter 1103. The Dead Sun. Why Sure's movements were stiff for a long time, and he did not speak. The required items were sun's remains, eternal fire, a seed of the abyss. The required condition was darkness of the realms. The required ritual was ignite hell, burn everything. In the end, he would be reborn from the boundless fire and light. This was the advancement required by East Lord, the peak of Heaven's Inquisition. In this regard, Tongi had already made a detailed explanation. Among them, O sun's remains, referred to the divine crystal left by the former sun god. Eternal fire was the source of eternal light from the scorching sun. O seed of the abyss was the essence and power from the ruler, and darkness of the realms, as the name implied, was the moment when the border of the present realm and hell lost their light. In the end, he ignited the entire hell and burned everything, including himself. From the collapsed hell, he would become a new sun that rose and shone with endless light. He would become East Lord. It should be said that this was an advancement that belonged to Huai Shi alone, and it was more than one level higher than the requirements required for East Lord's advancement. Moreover, this was only a part of it. Among the names listed in the long list, none of them were easy to deal with. Sun's remains required him to find the divine crystal left behind by a sun god before he fell, but the problem was that most of the sun gods, as long as they had a name, were killed by someone who passed by many years ago, and not even a handful of ashes were left. The rest fell into the rancher's stomach. If he wanted to dig it out, he had to jump into the mouth of the destruction elemental and find it himself. Eternal Fire's requirement was the most general. It required Huai Shi to find an inextinguishable fire, an untainted light. Seed of the Abyss, on the other hand, required Huai Shi to kill at least one ruler with matching attribute. Then, he had to dig out their solidified souls and authority from their corpses and make them into his own advancement materials before drying them. The most torturous thing was the prerequisite, darkness of the realms. As everyone knew, the sun was the projection of the pillar of the divine essence in the universe. If they wanted to plunge the entire reality, the border, and even hell into darkness, they would have to ask Huai Shi to turn off this light. But this thing was not a switch placed next to the door, where anyone could just go and press it. Even if Huai Shi managed to find the switch, who knew what kind of chaos it would cause the moment the spirit's essence pillar went offline? That was the foundation of the three great seals. Unless Huai Shi had made up his mind to become a traitor in the dark, he would never consider it. One could only say that there was still a long way to go. The moment he received the list, Huai Shi almost wanted to delete his account and stop playing. Fortunately, the most illusory requirement had been met by him first, the eternal inextinguishable flame, which referred to the eternal light. The flame had never been the focus. On the contrary, the light created by the fire was its essence. And Huai Shi happened to have a set of Helios's miracle in his hands, as well as the Ascension mystic instrument created by the Grand Master Publius. It pointed to his good brother, the Light King, Balder, who was still at his beck and call even though he was already dead. At that time, Huai Shi would be the Light King's mortal incarnation, holding his authority in his hands. The eternal light was not a problem at all. If the Continuation Academy could help solve the sun's remnant, then it was not impossible for him to work hard to fulfill the seed of the abyss. Anyway, couldn't he just call for help if he couldn't win? Recently, there was still the War of the Realms. Although it was not easy to find a ruler, it was better than finding a needle in a haystack in the vast abyss. As for the darkness of the realms, he could only hope that Tongi's estimation was correct. As everyone knew, for the Astronomy Society, destroying a world was as easy as eating and drinking. After every major adjustment and turmoil, such as the War of the Realms, the Astronomy Society would spend a huge amount of correction points to reconstruct the present realm. After the old world was disintegrated, the present realm would be reconstructed on this foundation, reinstalling the sea disk, or rather, replacing it with a new one. The 15th World Destruction Plan and the World Creation Plan should already be in the process of preparation. At that time, the three Great Seals would definitely be temporarily closed, and the Spirit Marrow, Origin Substance, and Pillar of Change would also be offline. Huai Shi might be able to hitch a ride and find an opportunity to advance. If that was the case, Huai Shi might not have a headache. After all, as long as there was a path, he could just take it. Bumps and bumpy roads were better than no roads at all. But the key was that he had to take more than one path. At the same time, he needed to prepare for and accept the advancement at the same time. Not only did Yun Zhongjuan need to advance, but Great Ming also needed to advance at the same time. Otherwise, he would not be able to achieve the embryonic form of Tai. In fact, he might even be devoured by his own deluxe version of Dong Jun's advancement. In the original deduction and calculation, the key reason why everyone who advanced to Dong Jun would become an artificial sun without any consciousness was that no matter how firm and tenacious a human's soul and will were, they could not withstand such a violent and huge divine power. The miracle was too huge, and it would crush the soul of the ascendant. Now, Tongyi still dared to add more without any scruples. Other than letting Huai Shi take the deluxe version of the advancement at the beginning, her biggest assurance came from the other sacred mark, Chang Shi, which was originally designed to assist Dong Jun and prevent him from going out of control. Chang Shi was named after the moon goddess. Compared to Dong Jun's tyranny, Chang Shi was the embodiment of mercy and peace. But in fact, just like the light of the moon was also reflected from the sun, these two sacred marks were two sides of the same coin. Chang Shi, an outsider that did not exist in Jyoga, was a control mechanism that Tongyi specially added in the Road of Heaven's Inquisition after countless failures. It was a buffer layer that was tailor-made for Dong Jun. Its essence was the combination of the divinity of Shi He, who was known as the Sun Protector, and Chang Yi, who was known as the Moon Mother. In the end, it formed a protection that was enough to protect the soul and will of the ascendant from being burned by the sun. Otherwise, once the advancement began, Huai Shi would probably become the fuel of the sun, and he would not be able to achieve Dong Jun. In order to form the embryonic form of Tai, Tongyi added more water to the noodles, and water to the noodles. She was unwilling to reduce the ingredients, which directly led to the difficulty of Huai Shi's advancement from nightmare level to nightmare level. Fortunately, she also knew that she could not get over her conscience and promised that Huai Shi would not have to worry about Chang Shi's advancement. She would take care of it herself. Otherwise, he would probably only feel despair, and now, the Continuation Academy happened to place such a clue as the dead sun in front of Huai Shi, which had already given him an irresistible reason. But, can I ask something? He raised his hand curiously. Excuse me, who is the dead sun referring to? After all, as far as I know, the death of the sun god of the present realm is more thorough. It's normal to be suspicious. After all, even the Continuation Academy can't determine its state now, 008 replied. The clue we have is the whereabouts of the sun god of the Indian lineage, Surya, Tisk. Huai Shi seemed to hear a certain someone's displeased voice. He pretended not to hear and continued to listen to 008. Hundreds of years ago, before the gods chose to unite, what was going on for a long time was a war of unity and authority. Many gods fell as a result. Among them, the most tragic fall was in the realm of the sun. Although Surya was not spared, due to Brahma's reminder, before he fell, he transferred his divinity and authority to another place in advance to prepare for his resurrection. However, the plan did not catch up with the changes. Due to the birth of the rancher, Surya's resurrection ritual was affected and interfered with. It was destined to fail, but it was not a complete failure. If I have to say, after the separation of consciousness, the sun god is now in a state of neither life nor death, 008 reminded him. If you want to find the remains of the sun, this will be your best chance. Other than that, I'm afraid there's only a pile of leftovers left to choose from in the whole realm. Hee that dog, I said. I'm so pissed off. Those Indians are the same as their gods. None of them keep their words and do things reliably. They have 100,000 ways to run away and slack off. Huai Shi could only pretend not to hear the resentful whispers of a certain black-hearted woman. After thinking for a moment, he could not help but ask, Why do I feel that the Continuation Academy seems to want me to participate? Indeed, this will be the first step in our formal cooperation, won't it? 008 did not hide, nor was he afraid that Huaishur would take the opportunity to raise the price. In addition, regarding your advancement, we will provide all the help we can in the future. However, now it seems that other things may not need to worry too much about unpopular characters like us. To be honest, this is a bit overpriced. Huaishur rubbed his face and said helplessly, as a tool, I still know what I'm capable of. You guys have come up with so many things, I'm a little scared, you understand? In terms of investment, some of us have already felt that such a strategy is too conservative. 008 was silent for a moment, and a trace of melancholy seemed to emerge in his dry electronic voice. Sir Huaishur, we are eager to witness the birth of a East King. After all, celestial genealogy is not the only one in this world who yearns for the return of the utopia, even if the behemoth of the past cannot return to its former height in a short period of time. This is not the reason why it must be missing. The absence of one of the three pillars is not a good thing for the astronomical society or for the present state. With that, 008 handed a grey invitation letter to Huaishur. We will look forward to your reply. In this regard, Huaishur could only be silent. In the end, before leaving, 008 asked again, Do you have any other questions? To be honest, there are a lot. Huaishur shrugged. When to leave, when to come back, about what to do. You have to tell me something I can know, right? 008 raised his hand and took out a thin book from the briefcase again. This is an answer book specially prepared for you. It includes our schedule, the parts you need to be responsible for, and so on. This is really... Huaishur's eyes twitched and he could only say, well prepared. This is the style of the Continuing Academy. 008 replied indifferently. Besides that, is there anything else? Huaishur thought for a moment and finally asked, There is another question that has nothing to do with me. Please speak. Shangazumi, why did he agree to participate? Huaishur asked, What did you promise? 008 seemed to be silent for a second, but it was so short that people couldn't tell. In the end, he replied, We promised him a position in the plan, that's all. His purpose is the process itself. The messenger of the Continuing Academy said, in the last stage of his life, Mr. Shangazumi wants a battle. A battle that can make him commit himself wholeheartedly like a swordsman and generously die. He wants a death that is worthy of the identity of the Sword Saint. In this way, the final answer was made. 008 took a step back and took a last look at Huaishur and the air behind Huaishur. He nodded slightly, as if saying goodbye. He turned and left. Soon, the figure carrying the briefcase disappeared behind the open door. Chapter 1104. It was the same as an illusion. Huaishur actually saw a trace of fatigue like the gray-robed man from 008's back. Don't think about it. It's not the same person, although that guy isn't much better. Tangi emerged from the air, looking unhappy. After all, it's the Dean. What the hell? Huaishur's legs went soft and he almost sat on the ground. He looked back and forth in disbelief at the direction where Tangi and the figure left. Him? The Dean? Should I say the Dean, or the remnants of the Dean? It's hard to say. Tangi took out a washed apple from her pocket and took 2 bites. The Continuation Institute is so mysterious, even the Dean is the same. Internal changes are never announced to the public, and internal results are never released to the public. Similarly, internal deaths are never known to the outside world. After implementing mysticism to the end, even the Continuation Institute itself doesn't know how many secrets it has, including who the hell is the Dean. They don't even know who the Dean is. Huaishur was puzzled. This was getting more and more ridiculous. If you're the boss and you're always covered by a chemical suit and a gas mask, how many subordinates do you think will recognize you? Regardless, the one who is recognized by the continuation court is the dean himself. Do you think the continuation academy will call me dean? It can't talk. Tongi shook her head and replied indifferently. But I'm afraid it can do everything except talk, right? No, maybe it can really talk. After all, the artificial intelligence that communicates with the outside world has never said where it comes from. The Continuation Institute is alive. Huaishur was not referring to the organization and structure they formed, but the building itself. How could the existence that can block so many pollutants and distortion values be just two simple walls? It has its own will and will choose agents for itself. And the unlucky ones who are chosen will be tortured forever when they are alive, and will contribute their remaining heat when they die, without any peace. What you saw just now was the dean it chose. Perhaps it was a candidate, or perhaps it was a remnant of the previous dean. No matter what, that number is quite close to the front. She paused for a moment before concluding. The Continuation Academy values you, Huaishur, be it the organization or itself. But that is to be expected, since those who could not see your potential and ability are either idiots or blind. Ahaha, it's a little embarrassing for you to praise me like that. Huaishur scratched his head shyly. I'm just praising the tool. What are you so proud of? Tongji rolled her eyes. In short, be prepared to be entangled with them in the future. Who knows what those guys are up to? Don't think that they're kind people. For those guys who only care about results, if you're useful enough, they'll even stuff the elemental of destruction into your stomach and lock you up like a prison. Huaishur froze for a long time. Now, it shouldn't be that bad, right? Don't worry, it shouldn't be that bad in the future unless there's really no other way. Tongji said calmly, to them, a disposable tool or a permanent ATM, it's still clear which is more valuable. After all, once Russell succeeds in restoring the utopia, you'll definitely be the next master of the pedigree and the future king of the utopia. In a few decades, after that old bastard kicks the bucket, you might also be able to elect the next president. It's such a distant matter. Don't give me a shot of adrenaline, okay? Besides, Russell is only a little over 100 years old, and you're already calling him old. For some reason, Huaishur's movements suddenly stiffened. He tried hard to restrain the urge to twitch his face, and then abruptly changed the topic. So, should I go or not? Go. There's good stuff to get, so why not? Tongi glanced at him with a smile as if she knew what he was going to say next, which made Huaishur's hair stand on end. Ahem, well, I feel that it'll be very dangerous. He tried hard to ignore the premonition of death that was close at hand and continued to ask, look, after all, the Continuation Institute also said that it's very dangerous, right? If we don't come back, won't we be used as a private vehicle and suffer a tragic loss? Scared? Tongi laughed. Scared. Huaishur nodded frantically, not knowing what she was referring to. In short, very scared. It's natural to be scared, but don't worry. Tongi shook her head. When the Continuation Institute said that it's dangerous, it means that they're only 80% sure, so they're a little panicked. It's like a top student telling you that it's very difficult after the exam, but you can't do it anymore. There's definitely danger, but those guys are like the gods in some cheap novels. They never give experimental subjects tasks that exceed their abilities. So, as long as you work hard, there won't be any major problems. Hearing what she said and seeing that her expression was normal, Huaishur was relieved. However, after taking 2 steps, he remembered his discovery and couldn't help but be curious. Tongi, were you angry at that time? No. Tongi smiled and waved her hand. Don't worry, I won't be angry behind your back or anything. Ahem, I mean the sun god. Huaishur asked tentatively. Because of Celia? No. Tongi shook her head. That's good. Huaishur nodded and comforted her. Think on the bright side. If you didn't fail back then, Wouldn't I be useless now? Right, I wouldn't. Tongi didn't say anything else. She looked at Huai Shi in silence for a long time, and told him word by word, I didn't. Okay, I got it. You didn't. Huai Shi nodded hard. Obviously super. 2 days later, in the Foundry Center, Huai Shi repeatedly confirmed that the assembly line was set up correctly and that there were no mistakes in the process. After confirming that the group of interns under his command had indeed figured out how to produce, he finally let out a sigh of relief. The process of creating alchemy was inseparable from the maintenance and care of alchemists, but the art of forging was much more convenient. The main thing was that there was a sufficient supply of origin substance and appropriate maintenance. Even if Huai Shi left, it wouldn't affect the operation of the assembly line. After all, they were all relatively low-end products, so there was no need to put in much effort and process. He had already thrown all the work that belonged to him to Yuan as usual. He also didn't need to worry about the training hall. With the heir appointed by the Sword Saint presiding over things, the little cabin in the forest assisting from the side, and a professional badass like Hades, even if things didn't go well, it wouldn't be too bad. Huai Shi only needed to use the name of Celestial Genealogy to support his students, and everything would be fine. As for Anna, she seemed to be frightened by the big sisters outside. In the past 2 days, she was very well behaved and didn't even cause any trouble. She even ate less. Huai Shi could only leave a lot of homework as a comfort, hoping that she would get over the pain soon. After dealing with all the other matters without stopping, Huai Shi sat at the table in the Stone Marrow Hall and looked at the thick book that the Continuation Academy had left for her. She also looked at the invitation letter in front of her. He hesitated. According to the Continuation Institute, if he was willing to accept the invitation, as long as he opened the invitation when he was ready to leave, they would receive the news. But just as Huai Shi was about to open the invitation, he heard a knock on the door. The courier from yesterday's delivery waited with a smile. Every time it was this person, it always made Huai Shi wonder if there were no other salespeople in their company. Please sign for it, Mr. Huai Shi. It's right here. The courier pointed to the blank space in the document. After confirming that Huai Shi had received the goods, he left without any sense of presence, leaving Huai Shi and the cardboard box in front of him. It felt like there was a problem, especially when he saw the sender's name was Russell. The box was wrapped in layers, just like Russell's own bad taste. After 6 layers of dolls, there was only a small box left in his hand, which seemed to be able to hold a diamond ring. Huai Shi couldn't help but feel a little scared. What if this old thing awakened some terrible hobby? Should he put righteousness before family? Or should he put righteousness before family? It was really hard to choose. When he reluctantly opened it, he found that there was only a glass bead the size of a thumb inside. It was translucent and made of crystal, but the rough surface and the uncorrected edges and corners revealed the maker's carelessness and perfunctory work. What the hell is this? Huai Shi picked it up and looked at it carefully. But in a trance, the thing in his hand disappeared without a trace. He couldn't see it anymore. It was like a bubble that evaporated in the sun. But when he looked up and looked around, he spontaneously felt a sense of fluttering and confusion, as if everything had changed subtly. But soon, this strange feeling disappeared without a trace. It wasn't until Huai Shi rummaged through a pile of cardboard boxes for a long time that he realized that he had been fooled by Russell again. In desperation, he could only call and ask in person. "What did you send me?" Through the receiver, he could hear the faint melody of a record on the other end of the phone, as well as Russell's low humming, pleasant and relaxed. As if thinking for a moment, he replied, "Well, just treat it as a lie." "A lie?" Huai Shi frowned. "Yes, a lie from Loki. As for the content of the lie, keep it a secret for the time being. Anyway, it's just a preparatory measure. Just forget about it." Russell replied calmly, compared to this, shouldn't you be setting off, why sure? Don't let others wait too long. Don't let you miss out on fun. Why sure rolled his eyes and hung up the phone. He didn't want to pay attention to this mysterious guy anymore. He tore up the invitation in his hand without hesitation. There was no door in the void. Neither did the earth shake or the mountains shake. In the blink of an eye, the world in front of him had changed drastically. The lush forest, the tall tower that reached into the sky, and even the familiar campus scene disappeared without a trace. Instead, it was replaced by a grayish-black enclosed space. Lights hung above the low dome, thick pillars, grayish-black ground, and a dark space that seemed to extend to the end of the world. And the most important thing was, in front of him, the noble girl with a smile, her crimson dress fluttering in the air like blood. Finally, in her hand, there was a stone sword that was slashing straight at his head. "Hello, Huaisher." Liz Heckermott greeted him. Chapter 1105. At that time, the sword was only 0.01 centimeters away from his forehead. But Huaisher knew that in the next second, the sword would hit nothing. Because without thinking, he rolled and slid on the ground, instantly retreating a distance of more than a dozen steps. When he looked back, he sighed. "Do you Americans always greet each other in such a ridiculous way?" "Yes." Liz dragged the stone sword and moved forward. The dark red stone pieces rubbed against the ground, bursting into dazzling sparks. "This is a welcome ceremony specially prepared for you, Huaisher." "Wow, that's such an honor." Huaisher was so moved that he couldn't help but clap his hands. "I thought Americans greet people with cannons. Little Liz, are you so gentle?" Liz's movements paused for a moment, and the coldness above her eyes burst out like a cold wave. Just like when she beat up her cheap uncle, she gritted her teeth and could no longer restrain her anger. In an instant, she broke through the air. "Don't call me Little Liz." It was difficult to tell which of the three slashes came first or at the same time. The iron light crisscrossed. Huaisher wanted to dodge and retreat, but when he looked back, he found that after the iron light in front of him left the sword blade, it formed a solid outline. It was as agile as a living thing and flew towards Huaisher on its own. It even cooperated with Liz's sword blade to block all escape routes for Huaisher, forcing him to face it head-on. He had no choice but to pull out the sword of virtue. Block. Sparks flew. Huaisher was stunned. "Wow, are you serious? What makes you think that after you sold me a bunch of junk, I should greet you with a smile, Huaisher?" Liz took a step forward and resisted Huaisher's power. She looked down and said, "If you ask me, using a stone sword instead of a divine mark to greet you is already the best way to restrain yourself." Cough, cough, everything can be discussed. Huaisher blinked innocently. "Well, everyone knows that goods are naturally divided into different specifications. If you're not satisfied with the basic model, you can always pay for the upgraded version. At most, I'll give you a year's worth of furnace repair service for free, okay? By the way, if you join the free upgrade program now, you can exchange the old model for the next generation of foundry for a little bit of money. Don't you Americans like this?" Speaking of that, he was no longer sleepy. He excitedly introduced, "Thanks to your sales strategy, we are now developing a cloud foundry center. Customers can submit their foundry blueprints to the large server that has just been built on the darknet for optimization and storage. Furthermore, they can also join our sharing plan. They can connect their foundry to the cloud, and all the foundry in the world will be divided into a part of the matrix to deal with the problem of large-scale border relics, benefiting the world. Oh, and if you join now, you can even get virtual coins that are priceless by participating in the forging process." After hearing that, Liz could not help but laugh. "Do I look like a fool who would pay for your work for free? You have to pay enough money first. I admit that I earned a little, but I can't be a mistress. Look at how generous the Eastern Xia Kingdom is. How can you monopolize it?" "That's right," Zhang Wuji said. Huai retorted. Besides, everyone is for me and I am for everyone. One for all. How can you call me a fool? Then I'll ask you to make a sacrifice first. Liz sneered. In the stone sword, the phantom of the jaguar roared silently, bursting out a high-pitched sword cry. With your broken body I offer it to the gods. The earth cracked and endless blood spurted out from the cracks, falling down into the bottomless abyss below like a waterfall. This place had become a cruel altar in front of the gods. Now, holding the stone sword, the high priestess raised her eyes and looked at the sacrifice in front of her. There was nowhere to hide and no way to escape. This time I won't let you escape, bastard, she whispered coldly. No matter what tricks you use, it won't work. It was an obsession that had lasted since they met in the village of dusk. Hidden under their alliance, hidden under each other's understanding and recognition, was a determination that was deeper and even greater than that. Today, between you and me, we must decide who is better. Well, is it too late for me to surrender now? Huai raised his hands subconsciously and begged without hesitation. As long as you don't hit my face, you can have anything you want. You can even post an apology on Weibo. I'll write you 3,000 words, okay? It's not like we can't discuss the number of words. That kind of thing can wait until I offer your mouth to the corn god. Liz stepped forward indifferently. Don't worry, I'll let you live. Or, if you beat me, won't the problem be solved too? Seriously, why are you being so calculative with a music teacher? Huai scratched his head helplessly and sighed. Thinking back, I was beaten up by you every time. Last time in the village of dusk, didn't you also make a hole in me? Is winning or losing that important? Friendship comes first, competition comes second. Besides, we even danced. Before he finished speaking, he felt that he had poked a hole in the ground. No, it should be said that he had picked up the pot that should not have been picked up. Once again, Liz recalled the humiliating memories of being teased again, and her face became more and more ugly. Think about it carefully, don't let me live. She squeezed the words out from between her teeth. A bastard like you should just die. The spirit of left hummingbird rose from the endless blood and looked down at everything on the blood-stained altar with a hideous smile, waiting for the sacrifice to be made. Huai was stunned. He did not mind moving his body occasionally. Besides, who would not like to fight with a girl? However, he had just advanced not long ago, and he did not have time to get used to Yun Zhongjuan's strength. If he was not careful, wouldn't it be a major disaster? Or should he just grit his teeth and let her beat him up? Anyway, she would not kill him, right? But what if he was really beaten to death? How could he not tell that Liz had probably advanced a long time ago, and was trying her best to get back at him? Just as his mind was wandering, Liz, who was getting more and more gloomy, could no longer tolerate the frivolity and arrogance of her opponent. The stone sword slashed down again, and when it slashed down from the air, it made a high-pitched sound as if it was rubbing against steel. Under the crack, the color of blood swirled and rose to the gloomy ceiling. The sharp blade was already inches away from Huai eyes. In the end, it stopped abruptly in front of two thick fingers. Phew, that was close. The old man who came late sighed softly. We almost had a diplomatic accident. The palm, which was as rough as tree bark, was full of wrinkles left by time. The skeleton, which should have shrunk after the flesh and blood died, had become terrifyingly huge. Just that hand alone was enough to cover Huai head and crush his dog's head. But now it was blocking his way. Between the two of them, a thin and stooped figure suddenly appeared, holding a curved iron staff in his hand. His broad bones supported his body like an old mountain range. The stone sword stopped abruptly. When the old man's left hand knocked on the iron staff, the crisp sound made the blood and the crack on the ground disappear without a trace. How disappointing, Liz! The old man with the feathered crown looked at his junior, and couldn't help but shake his head and scold. I thought you sneaked out because you've finally grown up and wanted to find someone to confess to. But in the end, you're fighting. You're representing the American lineage, representing the inheritance of noble blood. Look, is this appropriate? Is this reasonable? The helplessness of being exasperated at his failure to live up to his expectations was simply overflowing with words. After a brief moment of astonishment, Liz could not help but squint at him. There was no respect. She suddenly asked, "How much did you bet with him?" "Of course, I bet all in. What's the point of a small fight?" "How could our Liz fight?" The old man proudly raised his head and answered without hesitation. After noticing Liz's strange expression, he suddenly coughed twice. "Ahem, it doesn't matter how much you bet. What's important is that I think highly of you." "Then I'll have to thank you." As if she had long been accustomed to the unreliability of her family's elders, Liz did not even have the interest to be angry. She just pulled out the stone sword from his hand. At this point, even if she wanted to hurry up and fight with Huaishur, with this old man here, she was afraid that she could not fight anymore. After leaving an angry look that said "be careful next time," she did not talk nonsense and turned to leave. And the old man finally turned his head back with a smile. Because his old and stooped body was so huge, even if he was half bent, his huge shadow still covered Huaishur's face, bringing a mountain-like pressure. Huaishur suppressed the urge to suck in a breath of cold air and squeezed out a smile. How are you, old man?" It would be fine if he did not realize it at the beginning, but if he still could not recognize it now, he did not want to live anymore. The crowned person of the American lineage was now an important assistant of the feathered serpent and the inner elder of the American lineage, the world's giant Teralt Cutlay. "How is it, kid? You heard what I said just now, right?" Teralt's old face suddenly grinned. He moved closer and revealed an expectant expression. "Kid, there are very few people in the whole realm with conditions like our Liz. Do you want to consider it?" Huaishur's expression twitched. He subconsciously leaned back and wanted to remind Teralt, "The one you are talking about is not far away." There was only a roar that broke through the air. A stone-toothed sword flew over from the distant darkness and mercilessly slashed the old man's head. Sparks flew and almost fell on Huaishur's face. Teralt reached out his hand indifferently and pulled out the stone-toothed sword that was wedged into the feathered crown. He glanced at him with a smile and turned back to encourage him before leaving. "Think about it carefully. I have high hopes for you." But the second spear engraved with tiger stripes pierced his old face. After a spark jumped, he casually caught it in his hand. Why do young people nowadays like to fight so easily? Love and peace are the true meaning. Just like that, he sighed and knocked the iron staff down. Just like that, the old man disappeared on the spot without any warning. Only Huaishur was left alone in the empty and strange hall. When he looked around, he saw nut shells, melon seed skins, and popcorn shards all over the floor. His eyes could not help but twitch wildly. How many people were watching the live broadcast here just now? Just as he was scratching his head, he heard a familiar voice behind him. "It's time to go, Huaishur." When Huaishur turned around, he saw the man standing there. His expression seemed to be eternally serious. His tie and cuffs were meticulous, and there was not a single wrinkle on his grayish-black robe. The lines were so smooth that it moved one to tears. The ivory tower was always reliable, the pillar of celestial genealogy, the last conscience of utopia. Vice principal? Huaishur was stunned. "When did you arrive?" "Just now." Isaac was silent for a few seconds, and his gaze drifted a little. "You were definitely here from the beginning. Let's not talk about these unimportant things. Follow me." Isaac took the initiative to walk in front, making Huaishur's heart turn cold. He's actually changing the topic. However, after this incident, there was nothing much to say. It was all an old score he had left behind in the past. How could he blame him for blocking the door? He followed behind the vice principal and stepped into a door that suddenly opened. However, behind the door was a narrow walkway, and beyond it was a cliff that was 10,000 feet high. In the deep darkness in the distance, there seemed to be a low roar. Countless huge modules descended or rose under the pull of chains and mechanisms, stirring up a cold wind. After passing through another door, they seemed to have come to a lawn under the sun. However, the sun seemed to have no temperature, and the scenery in the distance was too fleeting. It was like a bubble. "Where are we?" Huaishur asked. "The Continuation Institute." Isaac looked back at him and added, "It's not the peripheral institution you've been to, but the real headquarters of the Continuation Institute." He pushed open the door and walked into the spacious hall. It was like an afternoon tea party. Under the lazy and illusory sunlight, two ladies at a low table were talking about something. Sensing that they had walked in, they looked over at the same time. The one in front was about middle-aged. Her skin was slightly tanned, and there was a little red makeup on her forehead. There was no sign of gentleness in her demeanor, but her pair of golden eyes made people feel a sense of desolation and uneasiness. In her arms, she was holding a little monkey that was eating peanut. It was raising its paw, trying to pull its master's golden hair ornament. "Don't be rude," Isaac reminded in a low voice. "That's Nanin's mother of India's destruction lineage. In her arms is the living miracle, Hanuman." "Don't say it like I'm a grumpy old lady, Isaac." Nanin's mother shook her head slightly. She glanced at Huaishur and nodded as if she was praising him. Beside her, the old lady who didn't hide her age couldn't help but laugh. "It's rare to see you so reserved, Huaishur." The old man with short silver hair asked jokingly, "What's wrong? You don't even greet me when you see me?" When Huaishur finally looked over, he didn't dare to speak. He no longer cared about the demeanor of a navigator and the bearing of the disaster sword. He quickly lowered his head and saluted respectfully. "Emperor Qin." Chapter 1106. Huaishur, you still look like you can't straighten your back after taking advantage of me. The old lady didn't seem to care about Huaishur's politeness and awe. Instead, she shook her head and said, "If you don't have a thick skin, it will be difficult for you to achieve anything in the future." "Whether I have a thick skin or not has nothing to do with whether I respect others or not," Huaishur replied indifferently. "I'm just grateful for your help." "Ha ha ha, you're still so good at talking. You make me feel happy. I'll take it that you like to cast a long line to catch a big fish." Emperor Qing smiled happily, no longer showing his usual arrogant and indifferent look. Instead, he pointed to the seat next to him and said, "Since you've come at the right time, would you like to chat with this old woman for a while?" Huaishur was about to decline when Isaac took the initiative to say, "Sorry, I have something else to discuss with Huaishur. Next time then." The old lady waved her hand heartily. "I won't force you to participate in the afternoon tea party of us old people." The two old seniors were very gentle and didn't have the idea of showing off their master's demeanor to the young people. However, the monkey took advantage of Huaishur's inattention to pull his hair and went back while squeaking. It was very proud. With his mother beside him, Huaishur didn't dare to pick up the damn monkey and beat it up. He could only nod politely and say goodbye. After going upstairs and sitting down in Isaac's suite, the vice president brought over a glass of wine. After sitting down and pondering for a moment, he asked, "Did the president say anything to you before you came?" "It's as good as not saying anything." Huaishur shrugged and asked, "So, can you tell me first, what's the matter? Where are the enemies? How many should I kill?" "I don't know." Isaac shook his head. After taking a sip of whiskey, he sighed with some worry and said, "I'm afraid the Continuation Institute will have a lot to do. Don't you have any tips?" Huaishur curiously leaned forward from the sofa and winked at him. She was just short of saying, "Hurry up and take a look at the future, then come back and give me a spoiler," on her face. Isaac was silent for a long time, perfectly concealing the awkwardness of being targeted. There's too much noise on the timeline. I'm afraid the Continuation Academy won't give others such a chance. Everyone said that every edition was a god, but there were not many who were targeted like him in every edition. Take a bug like Kronos, for example. Everyone would take a stab at him when they had nothing to do. But after so many years, he was still a bug, and the only thing missing was to write a ban on his face. It couldn't be helped. As long as it was a one-on-one battle, the vice principal would always be a god. Strong crowd control and strong output. If he couldn't win, he would even block. The other side had no chance at all. If it was a group battle, then everyone would have to think of a way to ban the character. Otherwise, there would be no gaming experience at all. There was no surprise that the Continuation Academy would make the first move. What they had here, there would definitely be something in hell as well. If things turned into two-time manipulators playing with each other, then it would only become an endless loop without any value, and it wouldn't benefit the outcome. But even so, the vice principal still came here as a representative of celestial genealogy, which meant that he still had value in other aspects. Putting aside the role of a sublimator as a tool, a person like him who was a top scholar in over 40 subjects would always be an indispensable part of the decision-making process. I'm afraid you won't directly participate in this battle, right? Huaishur asked. It's hard to say. The mysticism of the Continuation Academy is always unpredictable. Isaac rubbed his eyes tiredly. It was obvious that he had inquired about and come into contact with such matters these days. It was a pity that he didn't have Russell's ability to wield influence, and there was nothing he could do about the deep-rooted secrecy system of the Continuation Academy. Huaishur shook his head and leaned on the sofa. They didn't even let me bring Nautilus. To be honest, I'm a little guilty. Think on the bright side. If the Continuation Academy doesn't let you bring it, it means they don't need it. The vice principal shook his head and raised his finger. Suddenly, several iron boxes were smashed next to Huaishur. Take these with you. He waved his hand and the iron boxes opened, revealing the densely packed relics of the border. The sudden burst of light almost blinded Huaishur's eyes. 2 gray gloves as thin as cicada's wings were the indestructible hand, a relic of the border from the ivory tower's storage. It was claimed that as long as the other parts were not burned to ashes, it could even touch the core of a star. On both sides were the ring of longevity and the wings of blessing of death and decay. One of the 2 rings gave the wearer an additional 60% of vitality, regardless of the ratio, while the other was a miraculous treasure claimed to be able to defend against all curses and protect the soul. And in the middle of the ring was a huge 5-colored diamond. Huaishur sucked in a cold breath. The legendary mark of miracle, rainbow eye? It remembered the wearer's best state. Once activated, it could directly backtrack the wearer to the save point 6 times. Below it was an entire row of the most powerful single-soldier lethal weapons that the Directorate of Command's Technical Department had sealed off for Beelzebub, numbered curse bullet. There were 8 bullets with sequences above 3,000, 1 with sequences above 800, and 1 with sequences within the top 100. Just these few items added together were already the Ivory Tower's most prized possession. Not to mention a full 1,000 milliliters of liquid source. It was enough for Huaishur to have enough power to bombard at full power for more than 10 minutes. Mr. Isaac, you didn't secretly move the school's secret storage, did you? Huaishur scratched his head. As the vice principal's secretary, he had never approved the withdrawal of these things. No, there were some things he had not even seen in the list. Isaac shook his head calmly. Don't worry. I only took what was within my authority. The rest are my personal and family collections. If you haven't used them all, remember to return them to me. This is a little too much, isn't it? Huaishur felt a little dizzy. It's just a precaution. Isaac was silent for a long time before telling him directly, I understand your style, but I hope you don't do too many unnecessary things, Mr. Huaishur. He paused and emphasized seriously, also listen to all instructions, understand? Huaishur was stunned. Maybe Mr. Russell has other considerations. I might have done something unnecessary. He looked down at the ice hockey on the table and sighed softly. But you have to understand, you are the future of celestial genealogy. You shouldn't be so careless. From the beginning, he had expressed his opposition to Huaishur participating in this plan. But just like in the past, his opposition would not work. When Kronos could not see the future that belonged to him clearly, the uneasiness hidden in his heart shook the 10,000-year-cold vice-chancellor. Was it really necessary to gamble so extravagantly? Could there really be so-called eternal victory at the gambling table? He did not know what Russell was thinking, but out of his trust in Russell, he did not question his judgment. Still, that did not stop him from doing what he could to prevent and remedy it. Protection for the future. Thank you, Mr. Isaac. I'll use them well. After a brief silence, Huaishur did not refuse Isaac's kindness and raised his hand to put them into the ultimate. Still, after several hesitations, he finally said, if the future only exists in a greenhouse, that kind of overly fragile and delicate thing is not what everyone wants, is it? Isaac said nothing. But outside the door there was a teasing laugh. Things like the future have to be there first. But as long as there is, it won't be too bad. After the door was pushed open, a cheerful face poked out. So, apart from miracles, the legacy of the divine Marrow Road is only doting? Seeing the younger generation shining on the battlefield, Isaac's mother's heart would be drunk even if she did not say it. Perhaps she would be so moved that she would quietly wipe away her tears, right? The vice-principal's expression froze and frowned slightly, but he did not get angry or scolded. Instead, he glanced helplessly at the newcomer and left his sight. He could not be bothered to argue. The first thing he saw was the tattoos that extended from beneath the leather jacket to her wrists and neck. Thorns, skulls, hearts, and profanities. Her pretty cheeks were smeared with smoky makeup, while her slender eyes and eyeliner were as sharp as knives. She swaggered in like a rider who had just returned from a motorcycle ride. After throwing her backpack on the table, she sat down beside Huaishur and patted him on the shoulder. She didn't hide her praise at all. You did a good job on the return trip, kid. If you want to get rid of Russell in the future, I will definitely vote for you in the Academic Affairs office. Really? Huaishur was overjoyed. It was not clear whether he was happy to be praised, or to hear that he had gotten rid of Russell and got a guarantee to get rid of him. Madam Chun, Isaac sighed helplessly. As a teaching staff, at least set an example for the younger generation. Also, Mr. Russell is the principal after all. Can you pay more attention to this kind of topic? Okay, just kidding, but the voting is true. Madam Chun grinned and took out a wine pot from her pocket. Do you want some? A wisp of alcohol flowed out from the gap she opened. It did not have the sweetness of wine. Instead, it was pungent like fuel. With just a sniff, Huaishur felt as if his lungs were on fire. Even without the toxicity, something that could make Yun Zhongjuan cough was definitely not something that humans could drink. Next to him, Madam Chun had already gulped down the bottle of liquid explosive. He did not know where the wine pot came from, but it was a relic from the border. The whole room was filled with the irritable and explosive smell, making it hard to breathe. Huaishur could only obediently serve alcohol and cigarettes to her senior in the midst of her shock. Speaking of which, this was the first time he had met this lady. Madam Chun, her real name was unknown, and she had never said it before. It was said that she was born in a family, but because of her choice to abandon her family name, the only thing that was known was the login name in the internal system. As one of the people in charge of the Hell branch of the Ivory Tower, in terms of position, she was also one of the executive vice principals of the school. At the same time, she was also a Tier 4 sublimator of the Eternal Road. Unlike Raymond, who had just advanced to a worker with a blank set of equipment, she was the Judgment Scale Anubis, who had been equipped with a full set of godly equipment for many years. She was a destroyer with all her specialties in war. She was an out-and-out humanoid weapon, and could be said to be one of the strongest combat forces of the Ivory Tower in Hell. Relying only on herself, without any support or logistics, she had forcefully wiped out the entire Hell and opened up a branch base for the Ivory Tower. She had maintained it for so many years. The Hell creatures that were annihilated by her every year could not only meet the research and development needs of the Ivory Tower, but she also had the spare energy to sell them to the outside world. The amount of money generated was not only enough to meet the daily expenses of the branch, but also to save up all kinds of top equipment with astronomical figures. Encountering such a big shot, Huaishur only wanted to hug her thigh tightly and build a good relationship with her. When everyone was done drinking, they would go to Hell together to kill a few rulers. At that time, everyone would split the harvest and help him accumulate the seed of the abyss. Wouldn't that be great? He really liked this big sister who could lead the team. After a round of drinking happily with Huaishur, Madame Chun seemed to have noticed Isaac, who was ignored by her. She looked around the room and asked, "It seems that this time, the three of us will team up and fight?" Russell really put in a lot of effort. Not only that. Isaac rubbed his forehead with a headache, sighed, and finally said truthfully, "Only the two of you are in charge of the battle. My main duty is to be responsible for listening to the command of Mr. Marcus." The former diplomat of the Republic, the uncle of the Roman Emperor, the old man who had been recuperating in the Ivory Tower for a long time. Compared to us guys who run errands, I'm afraid he's the real protagonist this time, right? At the same time, in the command bureau, accompanied by Jaeger, Russell finally saw his old friend again. He was in a wheelchair, dressed in a formal dress, and his white hair was meticulously tied up behind his head. As in previous years, he was gentle and elegant. However, after a long time, his face was already wrinkled and weathered. His eyes were turbid, as if he was distracted, staring blankly at the distant air. He didn't respond to the two visitors. "Mr. Marcus? Hello? May I ask if you still remember me? Did I take your linguistics class back then?" Jaeger greeted him for a long time, but he still didn't get a reply. In the end, he couldn't help but reach out and wave in front of his eyes. It only attracted a dull glance from the old man. Saliva dripped from the corner of his mouth. Jaeger frowned and looked at 002, who wasn't far away. "Since the Continuation Institute needs him, why don't they treat him?" Mr. Marcus refused. 002 replied indifferently. "A diplomat needs a clear mind and independent judgment. We can't take away one for the other. Besides, there is a problem that needs treatment. After examination, I don't think such a situation will hinder Mr. Marcus's performance." Okay. Jaeger restrained the urge to scratch his head, and his face was blank and dull. In other words, we have to place an unprecedented bet on an Alzheimer's patient who is about to forget who he is after getting old? He paused for a long time and sighed helplessly. "To be honest, I'm a little lacking in confidence. Except for him, the Astronomy Society has no other choice. When the covenant was signed, he was the only one who still exists, and only he can represent the agreement between heaven and hell." Russell took out his handkerchief and wiped the saliva from the corner of his mouth for his old friend. "It doesn't matter who he is, as long as he still remembers what he has to do." He paused, bent down, squatted in front of his old friend, and asked solemnly, "My friend, can you do your duty?" In the wheelchair, the old man's eyes moved slightly and looked at him. It was as if he had just woken up from a dream. "Russell?" "Yes, it's me." Russell nodded. "Are you okay?" "Just a little." Marcus thought for a moment and shook his head. "Sleepy." "That's normal. Russell said. Marcus, you're old and sleepy every day. From one dream to another, you can't tell whether you're awake or not. He asked softly, but can you still defend the rights and interests of the present realm and ensure that the glory of the utopia doesn't fall? At that moment, he saw the corners of the old man's mouth curl up slightly. It was as if he was happy. He glanced at him. Just like a long time ago, he was in high spirit. Is the work about to start, Russell? He murmured softly, as if he was talking in his sleep. Yes, the heavy responsibility is in your hands again. Russell nodded. Are you ready to face your enemy? Thus, in the wheelchair, the dull old man once again revealed the heroic smile of the past. A mere diplomatic mission is nothing. You're tuning in to the Phoenix Knights YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.